Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good? Awesome. Good to hear, good to see. It is super early. I went to karaoke last night, learned some moves, did a couple things. So excited to see everybody back in here. Welcome back to our final day of the conference. I'm excited about the sessions that we have and looking forward to wrapping up today's show and everybody getting back home safely. So thank you once again for joining DRJ here in Orlando, Florida. Once again, please make sure that you use the mobile app to share your survey comments and scores. Heard so many things about the conference, the different breakout sessions and workshops and the general sessions that you participated in. Your comments, great or bad, are super helpful, and it helps DRJ to make sure that they're continuing to refine and fine-tune content. So please be sure if you liked it, loved it, or hated it, either way, you give them the feedback. So we're gonna go ahead and introduce our first keynote speaker for today's general session, Regina Phelps. The title of her session today is Uncertain Times, Being Ready for What Happens Next. Regina is an internationally recognized thought leader and expert in the field of crisis management, pandemic, and continuity planning and exercise design. She is the founder and CEO of EMS Solutions, and since 1982, EMS Solutions has provided consultation and speaking services to clients in 5 continents. Regina is a frequent keynote speaker on international continuity conferences, and she's constantly rated as one of the top speakers in her field. She has several books. 4 of them will be available for you outside as you hear the end of her presentation today. And so without further ado, please welcome Regina Phelps.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm surprised to see so many people here after karaoke. That's great. So first of all, thanks for that kind introduction, Vanessa, and it's a great pleasure, as always, to be here in Orlando at DRJ Spring World. And today what I'll be talking about is uncertain times, being ready for what happens next. Now, I wrote this speech about 2 months ago, and it's kind of fortuitous given the fact that we've had the first bank failures over the weekend in the last 2 years. And it's a little unnerving, I suppose you could say, and it really, for me, echoes the importance that we actually are continually thinking about this issue of being prepared for what happens next. That's what we do for a living. So let me dig into my agenda. What I want to talk about initially is what I'm calling the COVID-19 hangover that the world is currently experiencing. And I also want to talk about something called global polycrises. And then the idea is, now that I've given you all of that depressing news, I want to talk about what can a business continuity manager professional do in order to manage these events that are facing us. And I'm going to talk about 3 things that are absolutely essential for you to have in place in order to be able to do that. And then, of course, I'm going to give you homework, because when I speak, I always give homework, because you can listen to me blah, blah, blah all you want, but you know, you got to do something with the information, and that's what I want to share with you. But of course, we are going to do a few polls today, so I'm sure you already know this from all the sessions you've been to, so please have available your phone and make sure that you've got the app up there and that you've got the sessions page and that you actually have added this session to polling and that you can scroll down to the bottom. This is going to be appearing about halfway through, and I've got 3 different polls for you. So let's first of all talk about the effects of the pandemic. So I've actually been doing pandemic planning in our firm since 1997. Long time. We've done hundreds and hundreds of plans all over the world. But what's fascinating to me about me is I never once thought about what actually happens when the pandemic is over. What happens to the world? What's happened to society? And so it was that last fall I was asked by 2 different clients to prepare several speeches and write a couple of articles on this very topic. What happens in the world in a post-pandemic space? So in that time, what I did is I read, probably, I don't know, many historical books, about 17. And I actually discovered that there have been 30 global pandemics going back to 432 BC. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them. But what I did learn is that there are very consistent things that have happened all the way back to 432 BC. And so I want to share those because it really gives you an idea about what we are facing, not only as a country, but as a globe, in order to recover from the pandemic. And that's why I do say that what we have is that we have a global hangover from the pandemic. And this is also based on the fact that this historical record is consistent for what are called societal disruptions. And I think given what we do for a living, we need to understand that pretty clearly. There's a good quote to start with that sort of frames my conversation with you today, and that's this: the effect of pandemics or epidemics are measured not only in their mortality, loss of life. The secondary consequences have been much more far-reaching and disorganizing than anything that could have been resulted from simply the reduction of the population. And that was from William Rosen. And that's absolutely true. Yes, there have been millions of deaths around the world, 1.1 in the United States so far, and every day, still today, somewhere between 300 and 500 Americans die of COVID-19 every single day. But the disruptions are far more than the deaths. And that's because of this concept called societal disruptions. And it's really about the impact of the pandemic on society, our behaviors in particular. And this, again, remember, is consistent over thousands of years. So societal disruptions essentially refer to the serious disruption of how our society actually functions. And it really looks at the fact that we have this incredible dysfunction and a breakdown of our agreed upon social norms. Now, what happens in the course of the pandemic related to this is that we have a major, often termed radical transformation of society. And that what happens is our old behaviors, our old certainties fall away, and what happens is that we have something new that emerges. Now, has this happened before? Yes. As I mentioned, 30 pandemics. The things I'm going to talk about have happened consistently. This particular piece of art is actually from the 14th century plague pandemic in Europe. And there's a quote that goes with it that actually is pretty chilling. And it says this: European society after the 14th century pandemic was highly strung, on edge, and quick to violence. So fierce and clamorous was life that it could actually endure the mingled smell of blood and roses. That gives you some sense about how pandemics can affect life as we know it. And this was from a Dutch historian. There are 5 actual consistent themes that have gone through all the last 30 global pandemics that we are currently experiencing right now. And this impacts our work and our lives. The first one is a complete distrust of government and public health measures. And there are just consistent things, again, going back all of these pandemics. So great suspicion of government, not trusting at all what decisions are being made. A resistance to any mandates, whether it's masking or vaccines or distancing or closures. A actual push on anything that slows the spread. I'm not saying that all society does this, but there's a good part of society that is very resistant to it. So that's closures and distancing. The resistance to masking, that actually started in the 16th century when they realized, oh my gosh, when you are breathing, you are actually pushing out all of these viruses and or bacteria. And so that started actually in that pandemic, which was the plague in the 16th century. And then the actual resistance to vaccines started in actually the 17th century with the actual first big smallpox vaccine program. You think, wow, we had vaccines in 17th century? No, not really. But what they did is back then they were beginning to think about the most primitive forms of vaccination. And what they would do is they would take a small amount of exudate of a smallpox from a smallpox victim. They would dilute it. They would scratch someone's arm, and then they would place that actual vaccine on that arm. And interestingly enough, it actually worked. One of the reasons that George Washington was so successful is he actually required smallpox vaccines for everyone in the army during that revolution that we might remember for the United States. So, lots of resistance, a lot of mistrust. Secondly, blame. We love to blame people. And so every pandemic has had a consistent blaming theme. Somebody's being blamed for something. So we're blaming other people. It could be different racial groups. It could be also gender-related issues. It might be the place of origin where it came from. So there's lots of finger pointing. Consistently in many of the pandemics over the last, I'd say, century, they have been often anti-Chinese because many things have come from Asia. So a lot of anti-Chinese sentiments, but also an excuse for anti-Semitism. There are some historians that look at the Second World War and say, yes, indeed, it was caused by certainly the treaties that were developed at the beginning of, or the end of World War I, which set this tone for World War II. But there are many people that also say in the historical world that it was actually the blaming of Jews in Europe for the spread of the 1918 flu that gave the rise to Hitler in Germany in the 30s. So it has a huge impact on society and how we interrelate with each other and how we are choosing to blame. The third is overall fraying of society. So historically, widespread crime of all kinds, political losses to those people who might have been in power during the course of the pandemic, a significant movement towards populism and autocratic governments, where the kind of strongman model begins to appear even more so, where the leader actually says, I can prevent this from happening to you again. And then lastly, kind of the idea that bad behavior just simply rules. People are just, not in their best behavior. So I noticed that in things such as people's driving even, where like people don't stop at stop signs. They kind of think of them as a suggestion and not a requirement. And so those kinds of things we see universally around the world as well. There were two others, conspiracy theories. They're not new. We've had them apparently going all the way back to 432 BC. Very common that we have these interesting, complicated theories about how something occurred. And we also have this apocalyptic thinking where religious leaders might say that the end is nigh, and it's also the time of judgment. And then lastly, interestingly enough, I finally came to something that's positive, the rise of the worker, and also the rise of organizing. And that's because many times the workers have been so affected, both through death and other issues, that there's a limited number of people to work, and therefore they have more power over their employers than they would have otherwise. So it's the rise of organizations. Those are consistent themes that actually go back to all of these pandemics. But there are some now that are specific to COVID-19. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the ones that are individual and then the ones that are society-based. So we have the same major decline in belief and expertise. I often would laugh at people when they were, or not laugh at them, but I would sort of be chuckled in the sense of where people would get some of their medical information. And often it was from places like Facebook, Twitter, other social media. One of my favorite epidemiologists, they talked about and started to circulate a little badge that was, my degree came from the University of Facebook, right? So the idea that people began to really think that they knew a tremendous amount about epidemiology and disease transmission, et cetera, because of what they'd seen on social media. So that's been a huge issue as far as our belief in anybody with expertise. Secondly is a general decline in trust of people. And think about the work that we do. We have to have people that actually trust us. And so when there's a decline in trust, that's a concern. Inequalities, of course, were really exacerbated in the course of the pandemic. Certainly in the area of race, you saw lots of more black and brown people being a lot more affected by the pandemic initially. There were income-related issues, and some of them had religious-related issues in some communities where there was a problem of transmission and therefore blame. Political divide and division. The country is probably the most divided it's been in a very, very, very long time, and across political lines. And so now people are utilizing politics as a way to identify themselves more than they probably had before. And so that's also a concern when you think about how we're trying to build groups and build teams, that sometimes those things can actually be a problem. And then lastly, of course, this incredible rise in misinformation and disinformation. And just to think about what those things are, just to be accurate, misinformation is where we actually have incorrect information that's being circulated, but disinformation is information that is deliberately circulating that is either misleading or actually wrong. And we have a tremendous opportunity, or we have an issue with that because of certainly social media and the ability that there is to circulate and actually transmit information to large audiences very quickly and extremely effectively. We also have 5 things that are going on globally that are also a problem. Financial hardships. Now, most countries in the world did not do what the United States did by actually giving pandemic funds to citizens. Many countries really, really suffered, and especially in the developing world. And so there has been inflation globally. There are many countries that are already in a recession. The United States isn't yet, as we know. And also, many of the developing nations were really impacted because foreign aid really decreased because, of course, we were taking care of our own. Global instability was certainly started with the pandemic, but it really has been fueled with the war in Ukraine. And you see that all along in Europe, but you also see that destabilization, not just in Europe, but also in places like Africa. And a lot of that's fed by things such as food insecurity. So we do a lot of work in Africa, and there are many, many countries that have really been impacted, and there is famine and severe food shortages in many places. A lot of that is because of the Ukraine war. Much of the grain that goes to Africa, for example, actually comes from Ukraine and Russia, and neither one of those have been exporting that grain to those countries. We've also had supply chain disruptions, as we well know in our business, which has a huge impact, not only to you personally, but to our businesses and the ability to be able to manufacture and get things done. And then lastly, there's been a huge increase in crime globally. Whether that's cyber crime or actual physical crime, there's been a huge increase in that, and that's been a big problem as well. So wow, those are all things that we can directly tie to the pandemic. But there's more. And what I want to talk about that really ties to this, and really I want you to be thinking about, because it's what we do for a living. And that's what's called a polycrisis. Anybody heard of this term before? Okay, no hands. So this became a popular topic in January because of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum meets in January every year in Davos, and one of the big issues this year was all focused around global crises and global risk. Every year, the World Economic Forum develops something called a global risk profile. And this year, it was really fascinating to read. So when you're like, well, what is a polycrisis? Where'd this come from? So there's a French philosopher who came up with this idea of a polycrisis in the 1990s. But it got new life at the World Economic Forum in January in Davos by a historian by the name of Adam Tooze. And what you'll see is that this is interesting, and now you're starting to see this term, polycrisis, appear in groups like McKinsey, where they're sending out articles to your CEO and to your executives. So you need to be familiar with what those kinds of individuals are thinking about and reading, and that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. So a polycrisis, the definition essentially is a cluster of global risks that have compounding impacts. So we have one risk, but it has a compounding impact to another. And so that means that after a while, the overall impact of a particular risk is exceeding the sum of its parts. And there are many overlapping crises right now in the world that actually allow this to happen. The climate crisis, the war in Europe, of course, the inflation and recessionary issues that are going on in many countries, incredible democratic dysfunction in many countries around the world, the health crisis, and a lot more. And so this is going to be something that we, as a profession, need to be very savvy about, because this is going to be something that we are going to be spending our time in the future. Now, I want to give you a couple of slides that were out of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Summary, because they really tell you how people are feeling and thinking about these global risks. And this slide in particular is interesting. They asked the respondents, there were several thousand people around the world that took this survey, and they do every year, and they're risk managers. And the question really is, how optimistic are you about the world? And this is the most pessimistic it has ever been. And if you just stop and just look at that slide for a moment, what you'll see is it starts from the left to the right. The left are darker colors, and then on to the right, you see these yellow colors. So the darker orange or darker brown, depending on how your vision is, that particular is the most pessimistic people. And what you'll see is that when you look at that in the next 2 years, about 17% of the people believe that essentially we're going to have some cataclysmic events. There's not much we can do about it. In 10 years, that number increased actually to 20, that we are at a tipping point in a variety of areas. And then you'll see that the next number over is this sort of lighter orange. Those people are still very concerned and are very worried about the tipping point. And it's not till you get to the yellow, which is super tiny, that anybody has any optimism about our ability to manage the big crises of the day. This is important for us to understand. This is what we do for a living. Now, when the risk report was issued, they primarily focused on 5 major areas, but I'm going to focus on 3, which are the biggest, most complicated ones. And those are economic, geopolitical, and social. And this mix in particular impacts us. And you may say, well, my company's only in America. Yeah, but it doesn't matter anymore. We're a global world, we're a global supply chain. What happens any place impacts us greatly. And so what I want to talk about is the destabilization of these 3 things and how it impacts us and our work and leads to more unpredictable risks in the future. The first one is the economic issue, which is global inflation. And we've had inflation here in the United States, of course, for the last few years. But compared to the rest of the world, we aren't doing bad at all. I do a lot of work in South America, and my clients in Argentina have had 100%, exactly 100% inflation in all of 2020 and all of 2021 and part of 2022. They are so happy now that it's dropped to 79% inflation annually. So, yes, we have inflation here in the US, but it is really bad in many places in the world, and this particular slide shows you that, and the darker the colors are, that gives you a sense of that. IMF is actually looking at and stating that right now, currently, hoping we don't have a banking crisis here in the United States, that we'll actually have peaked our inflation rate at the highest at the end of 2022. It will go down in 2023, but it's still going to be high in many places of the world. They're forecasting an 8.8% inflation rate from last year, 6.6 this year, and 4.3, in 2024. So that's good that we're actually dropping out of the double-digit inflation in many parts of the world, but it's also bad because there are a lot of places where it's not going to drop much. Why is this important? Again, this global instability. And when you have high inflation, that means people aren't able to feed their families, and that also causes a migratory crisis. So when they have no money, they're going to be moving for job opportunities and the opportunity to actually then have a way of raising their kids and feeding them, and therefore that destabilizes countries around the world. The geopolitical issue is a big concern. And that, of course, the war in Ukraine is one of the most destabilizing things we've experienced in many years. And that's also brought up many other things. It's had this huge impact in Europe, all the countries surrounding Ukraine, but it's also had this impact of famine now growing in Africa because of the grain embargoes that are going on. And there's also concerns about future wars in Europe and nuclear war and all of those other issues tied to the Ukraine war, and millions of refugees, not only from Ukraine, but all this displacement because of famine. The one I've been doing a lot of work on lately in the last 6 or 8 months has been the China-Taiwan issue. I have a lot of clients who have either offices in China and Taiwan, or one or the other, and the question is what happens in particular if indeed China goes to war with Taiwan, or they actually do an embargo around Taiwan because everything is imported to Taiwan. All of their fuel, all of their food, everything. If they have an embargo around the island, then what happens is that they can either starve or freeze depending on what's going on. So what are businesses doing and how is that going to impact us? And so I've been doing quite a few exercises related to the Taiwan-China conflict. And what is a business going to do if they have an office in Taiwan? And how are they going to actually manage that? Also, globally in the world, you need to also keep in the back of your mind that Taiwan is the biggest producer of semiconductors. So it will have a huge impact if this does occur. And then lastly, South America and Africa have had major uprisings. My clients in Peru in particular, if you follow South America at all, they've had incredible disruption, which has had a huge impact in their economy and destabilizing the southern part of South America. A little bit of that going on in Colombia and Brazil as well. So this has an impact to us. And then lastly, societally, there's a lot going on. Many things I've already talked about, so I'll talk about them quickly. The social cohesion is really disintegrated in many places around the world, and there's lots of polarization. There's a widening gap, if you will, between our current values, issues like equity, there's reproductive freedom issues, there's religious issues, there's LGBTQ, there's climate, there's lots of polarizing things that can be a huge division for us. Misinformation and disinformation, I've talked about that, the cost of living issues, issues related to healthcare. I want to just take a moment to talk about that. The United States in particular is really facing a huge healthcare crisis based on the effects of the pandemic. If you've tried to make a doctor's appointment in many places around the country, you often now wait for not just days, but weeks and sometimes months. There's places in the United States, especially in the rural parts of the center part of the country, where there aren't doctors at all. 60% of the doctors in the US right now, 20% of them are over the age of 60. There's less people getting into the field, and there's also less nurses. So here in the US, we are in a real tenuous position. But it's not just the US. Europe, in particular, is having the same exact problem. People are burned out and fried from the pandemic, and people are leaving the field. And as boomers are getting older, the drain on the healthcare system will be greater. This is going to impact everyone, and that's something for us also to keep in mind. Severe mental health deteriorations, and you certainly have seen that with recent studies that the CDC put out with the effects on young people in particular, girls in particular, where a third of the girls between the ages of 12 and 18 have contemplated suicide in the last year. Mental health for all of us, adults included, hasn't been so great with the pandemic, so that's also a significant issue. Loss of education and earning potential. In the 1918 flu, people that were between the ages of 5 and 18 never made up their earning potential or their education based on what happened in the 1918 flu here in the United States and pretty much globally. So that could be something that we could face here as well. And lastly, the climate migration issues that I talked about earlier, those are happening. So there is a lot going on in the world. There is a lot that could impact the work that we do. And so the question you're thinking is like, well, what the heck can I do with all these awful things? Well, there's one more thing I do want to mention before I give you some of those solutions, and that's the last issue is the climate change, which I haven't talked about. There was a study that just came out by the Ford Foundation, First Foundation, about climate in the United States in particular, and what they were looking at is the northeastern part of the US, where we're sitting right now. And this is actually the First Street Foundation. That particular slide that you see there is the expectations of what the wind, hurricane speeds will be in the next 30 years in this region. And you can see they are going to change markedly. This is a good study for you to look at. If you have offices, if you live in any of these states, in the next 30 years, these are only going to be more significantly impacted from water, hurricanes, wind. And then that's also tied to the issue of insurance. Here in Florida right now, there's a huge issue going on with Hurricane Ian and the insurance adjusters and readjustment that's going on. So you may have this hurricane, you may have insurance, you may have flooding insurance, but what's happening is that many of those insurance adjusters are reevaluating the initial adjustment, and they're reducing the payments they're going to be giving people by as much as 50 to 60% based on re-looking at things. So you may have insurance, but it may not be able to pay. And so this is going to be a significant issue, and think about that from your businesses and what we're doing in order to be able to stay whole. So we, as a profession, have a lot to think about. When you're thinking about what you should be looking at, planning for, doing in our future, there is a lot of stuff for us to be contemplating. And that's what I really want to talk about, is what is a business continuity professional supposed to do with all of this heavy-duty stuff I've mentioned to you this morning. There's a lot of things I could talk about, but I'm just going to focus on 3. I believe that my hope today is I don't want to depress you, but I want you to understand that things are tough. And we, as a profession, can make a huge difference. You can make a huge difference in your company, in your community, in your family, in your career by what you do. And there's 3 things in particular. If you're only going to do 3 things to be better prepared, I want to talk about what those are in a really short, compressed time frame. The first thing is situational awareness. We need to understand and know what's going on around us. And situational awareness is absolutely essential. It's not always easy, but it's absolutely essential, and I want to talk about that. How do you get it, and what do you do with it, essentially? The next thing I want to talk about is effective crisis management programs, and that really looks at the teams, the process, the plans, the exercises. I could talk about that for 8 hours, but I'm only going to talk about it for a few minutes. And the last one is crisis communications. What do you say to all of your identified key stakeholders? Now, many of you may not be responsible for communications, but it is so important in the work that we do, communicating to our employees, to our customers, to the communities we serve. We often need to work very closely with the communicators, even if we are not responsible for them. So it's important that we understand how we can do that the best we can. So those are the 3 things that I'd like to touch on. The first thing is this issue of situational awareness. This is so important because we need information in order to develop a response, to assess, to understand what's going on. But how do we get it? What do we do with it? How do we validate it? How do we display it so people can understand it? Sometimes it's just so much information. Other times there's not much. But we need to understand this because this drives everything that we do. So situational awareness, just to stop and think about what that is, I'm really talking about the ability that we have as a group to be able to identify the information, bring it in and process it, and then be able to comprehend what that means to our organizations. And so it really is asking and answering the question is just simply knowing what's going on around you. Easier said than done. Now, situational awareness requires that you do 2 things. You got to collect information. So that first of all, it means you know where you're collecting it from, and then you're bringing all of that information to you, and then what you have to do is that you have to process it. You have to look at it, validate it, understand what it means, and then being able to organize it in such a way that you can present it to the people that need it to make decisions, and they can do something with it. That's a lot. Now, Our immediate task actually is, of course, is to gather situational awareness, and what we're answering to the question is, what do we know? So stop and think about all the places that you could get situational awareness. So just hold that in your mind for a moment. Because when you get that situational awareness, what you want to understand is, okay, first of all, what is the impact? What's impacted? Who's impacted? So I go through my list always. I always start with people, and I'm going to ask myself, are my employees impacted or affected in any way? Or what about my customers? What about my communities? What about the area around my office? Any vendors impacted by this? What about visitors? I need to understand all of the people-related impacts. Next is the issue of facilities. Where are my facilities? Are they impacted by this particular incident? Then I want to understand, does this impact my technology assets? That becomes also a little bit more complicated with work from home, because we've got people everywhere, and you have technology assets wherever they are. So that also becomes an issue. Is this an impact to my mission-critical, time-sensitive business processes? And then lastly, does it impact the reputation and brand of the organization if we don't manage it effectively? And then asking the question, could this get worse? Excuse me. So this is like can be drinking out of a fire hose. Sometimes in an instant, there is so much information, you just don't even know what to do with it. And stop and think about all the different places that it could come from. So when you're looking at this too much information, essentially what we're looking at is, how do you manage it? How do you actually bring it to you? You need a plan. You need tools. There are vendors in the exhibit hall that have tools and processes that can help you in bringing in situational awareness. But we have to be skilled and practiced so when the bad thing happens, we can do it pretty effectively. And then what we want to do is we want to consider the following things about the information, which is, where are your sources? So just in a company, one of the things that we make our clients do when we do a crisis management program for them is we make them map their world. I want to know every single place in the organization where something could come from. So what does that mean? Well, you have the usual cast of characters. The NOC, Security Operations Center, it could be the help desk, it could be a customer call center, it could be a customer hotline. Maybe you have a supply chain process that you're monitoring, and actually that would be another source. Maybe some HR-related concerns. Where are all of those different problems likely to come from? I want to know where those are and what they have in place. And if something goes on in those places, do they know to let us know? Otherwise, it kind of goes through the normal chain of command, and by the time it gets to you, it's been a problem for a while. So how do you bring those things to you? So that's really important to understand. So what are your internal sources? And then, of course, what are all of the external sources as well? How do you assess the information to know that it's accurate, that it's right? And when you assess it, how can you then do something about it? How do you make that decision you need to do something? How do you validate that the information is right? And then, how do you display it in some way that an executive or people in your crisis management team can actually use it for making decisions? Is super important. So when you're actually looking at all that information and you're gathering it, you should have, and you're hopefully in your plans right now, you've got a full list of all the internal and external sources in your that you need to be following. So internal, I mentioned many of them. It could be, again, the help desks, the NOC, the SOC, all of those places, plus some that might be a little more esoteric. But where could a problem begin to emerge, and how do you have them plugged into you so that they know when something goes on, they can actually reach out to you? Externally, what things are you monitoring? Obviously, probably, city, state, federal agencies, different groups, weather, travel, all the other items that are important that you need to have your hand on at all times, so you know what's happening in the external environment. And then what you want to do then after you've got all of those things brought to you is you have to verify them, because you need to be an accurate source. So what you want to be doing is you want to verify these to make sure that it's reliable. That means we're selecting reliable sources with a high level of dependability. We're using multiple sources so we can actually triangulate back to know that it's right, and that we're going to compare notes to make sure that the information is 100% accurate to the best of our ability. And even with verifying, things will change. So just because you got all this situational awareness and you finally got it displayed in a way that everybody can use it, that doesn't mean that it's not going to change over time. And those things have to be continually refreshed for decision making on the part of the crisis management team. Super important. Okay, we're going to get to the poll question, my first one. So be armed and ready. Okay, how would you describe your organization's ability to gather, validate internal and external situational awarenesses? This is your choice. You are evaluating yourself as top-notch, highly skilled. Number 2, making progress, working on collecting, evaluating, and disseminating information. Number 3, we have a long way to go. Number 4, what? So take a moment and ask yourself, are you top-notch? Are you making progress? You got a long way to go. You can be 100% honest here because, of course, no one knows what you've said. So let's take a look and see where we are. So we've got 30% of you identify yourself as top-notch in your organizational awareness as far as getting information in. That's really good. 54, making progress. 23, got a long way to go. Only 1% of you are, what? That's good. So this is something that you need to be honest with and evaluate and look at on a regular basis. And you also need to make sure that you go back and look at any new things that might have popped up that you need to be adding to this mix that you have. Okay, very good. All right, let's move on. So let's talk about crisis management teams. Could you flip my slide on the monitor here? Thank you. Okay. So let's talk about crisis management teams. I spend probably, my professional career is 50% designing crisis management teams for corporations, and the second is designing exercises. This is, I think, one of the most important things that we do. And I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but I won't. But I want to start simply with a glossary. And this is an exercise I do with anybody that I ever talk to when they say, I'm interested in crisis management. Okay, great. And one thing about our profession I love about us, but our glossaries are all different. Everybody calls things differently. So I want to make sure we're all saying the same thing here. So this is what I often do with folks and say, okay, this is the deal. There are 4 things at the bottom of this slide. I just want to give you the quick one-sentence definition so that we're not confusing them. I know you all know this, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page together. Emergency response, what happens in the first few moments, first few hours to protect life and safety. Secondly, when you look at the issue of business continuity, how to recover time-sensitive, mission-critical business processes. Disaster recovery and technology recovery, recovering all of your key technology assets. Last one, crisis communications. What do you say to all of your key identified key stakeholders? Those 4 things in a crisis all report up to crisis management, which is the umbrella across the organization that manages the event. Then within that, it should be in an envelope which is called business continuity program governance, and within that, it's often sitting within something called enterprise risk. I know you know all that, but I just want to make sure that we are clear about what I'm talking about with crisis management. Crisis management you need at every single level of your organization. One of the things that we do when we work with a company is we always map everything out. You need somebody at every place you have a shingle that knows how to evaluate a crisis possible situation and who to call. Otherwise, they're going to do all kinds of things, and we're going to delay and wait or call the wrong person, and you're not going to get the information that you need quickly. So when we actually tier an organization, we'll look at it. We map a company, and if it has multiple locations, looking at the headquarters, the mothership, as I call it, There's probably going to, if it's over 1,000 employees, I expect to see 2 crisis management teams. One is an executive team, which is all strategic in nature, really looking at primarily 4 jobs: strategic policy, approving large expenditure of funds for the team below them, relationship management, which means they're basically a big person at that company is talking to another big person at a customer or government or others. And then lastly, they may be the media spokesperson. Those are the only 4 things that they're responsible for. The tactical team manages the rest. If you have more locations, you're probably going to have another tier below that, which could be a manufacturing facility or a distribution center or some big office, regional office. They're responsible for managing the crisis locally and, of course, reporting up to the mothership. And then if you have even smaller places below that, they still need probably a 1 or 2 page crisis management plan that talks about how to assess an incident and who to call. And that should be throughout your entire organization. Because if we're not clear about that at all levels, when the bad thing happens, you won't know about it. And that is a big concern. When you have an effective crisis management program, what you have then, not only do you have this adequate tiering and teams at all locations, then you've got the plans that they need, and they could be relatively tiny for the lower levels and more robust as you move up. But they need plans with 2 things: clearly defined roles, and I really want to emphasize authorities that have been granted. What I see often is that somebody will have a crisis, and what happens is that because executives have not really given them the authority to actually act, there's a lot of all of a sudden tension that develops about who's making what decisions and what can they actually do, because it's not noted. It's not been noted and approved. So having the authorities that go along with the responsibilities are absolutely essential. They have to be trained, of course. And the training, the best training you can have, besides the initial probably training you might give them about the plan, the process, and the teams, is all through exercises. Now, in exercises, of course, they really need to have at least 1 really thoughtful, well-designed exercise a year. We've often advocated for our clients that they do something called ripped from the news exercises, short, little, tiny simulations. But what those are good for is they're good for like understanding a role. They're good for understanding assessments. They're good for writing an action plan. But they're not going to develop deep thinking, which is what people need in practice to actually manage a crisis. But they're good for these more short-term experiences. So they need an annual exercise that really is going to push them and mature them beyond what they are right now. The last thing is they need to have a really clearly identified assessment process. When we audit plans, often what I find is I don't see on page 1, when I open it up, what the job is about assessing an incident. Who has the responsibility to assess an incident? What criteria are you using? Do they have authorities to activate a plan? And so what we look for in the plans that we write, we say we need an incident assessment team. These folks are part of the crisis management team, but they have one other job, which is to come together at the moment that anybody in the organization has called that magical number. They get together, they assess an incident, use the criteria, and they actually get it going. That, again, needs to be practiced with some regularity, which is a small simulation is really good for that. And they also need to then, again, have the authority and the responsibility. The criteria is one that's also important, and I often don't see that as well. We used to design really complicated criteria, and you could weight it and all of that, but I've discovered after all these years of work is that you only need to talk about 5 things whenever your incident assessment team ever gets together. The first thing is you always talk about people, because people, most important, right? Is there a life safety related issue? Anybody injured, killed, etc. Number 2, what about your facilities, your critical infrastructure? Are they able to function? Can you perform work in those places? Number 3, technology. Is there an impact to your technology assets? And of course, we're talking about physical infrastructure, but also information security. Business. Can you perform your time-sensitive, mission-critical business processes? Is this going to have a significant impact on your company financially? Those are all kind of under that broad umbrella. And then lastly, if you don't manage this well, will this actually impact your reputation and brand? The first three are very, they're very clear. You can see them very easily. They're tactical in many ways. The last one's very subjective, but equally as important. So, polling question number 2. What grade would you give your organization's crisis management team and process? So I've talked about plans, teams, exercises, etc. So you have basically 5 choices. Give yourself an A. You have a great team, good process, great plans, great exercises. Number 2, you're making progress in all 4 of those areas. Grade C, you could be better. If you have a D, needs lots of work, and the last one is just sort of a scream for help. So take a few moments. All right, so here we go. Okay, so, interesting. So we have changing. 19% of you would say that you have a great team. That's wonderful. 37 says you're making good progress. That's great. 25 saying you could be a lot better. 12 says you need a lot of work. And 2% of you are screaming for help. Okay, we have a readjustment here. I love this. 16. So we're heavily weighted in the making good progress, which is great. This is one of the things, by the way, that constantly needs your attention. Membership changes, training needs to occur, new threats arrive that need exercises. So this is a piece of our work that is never, ever, 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 ever going to be done, but super important. All right, the last thing in my list is crisis communications. Are any of you responsible for crisis communications at all? Okay, a couple of you put your hand up. I didn't think many of you would be, but it's so important. It is so important because if we can't get out messaging in a proper and timely manner, it impacts all the work that we do. So I want to talk about it, even though that I know that most of us have a collaborative relationship with crisis communicators, but we're ultimately not responsible for it. So effective communication really requires that we have an established team, we have processes that bring all of the company communicators together. What does that mean? When we design for these kind of processes for companies, I like to form what's called a JIC, a Joint Information Center. That's a term used out of the federal government and used in state government as well. A JIC is essentially where you bring everybody that talks to people. There's lots of people that do that. So it's not just corporate communications. It's investor relations. There's somebody out of HR because you need to communicate to employees. There's sales and marketing. There's other folks that are communicators, people that, who's in charge of the customer call center. They have things they have to say to people. And you bring those communicators together so that when they actually are developing messaging, they can have consistent communications and they can get all of those authorities and messaging approved quickly. That's the advantage of having that concept of this Joint Information Center. What we're looking for in crisis communications is that we have a coordinated response and that we want to make sure that it is accurate. And when you have all the communicators together, you increase that exponentially. We want to make sure that we've identified all of the key stakeholders so that we're making sure that we're providing adequate messaging for them. And we have to do it in a timely manner, which of course is always challenging because if you haven't worked out a lot of these details in advance, what happens is that it takes forever, as you well know, to get any kind of communication approved. What you're looking for, of course, is this issue related is having effective communications and getting it right the first time. So what that means is that we have the right information aimed at the right people at the right time so they can make the right decisions, and we have the right communications. Many of my clients, I've really encouraged them to really look at their emergency notification systems as a lot more than just simply sending messages to your employees. And in communications in particular, I encourage them to look at actually literally using an E&S system to actually send messages to, where you send out press releases or you send out talking points to major reporters, people that follow you in a crisis, so they can see in real time what you're doing rather than having this long, protracted back and forth. Once they've been approved and sent out, it's much more effective. So thinking about things like an emergency notification system broader than just simply communicating to your employees. So question number 3. This is whether you actually are responsible for these people or not. And as we know from the audience, there's only a couple of you that are. So if you were to evaluate your crisis communications team, would you say they are highly skilled and practiced, A. B, helpful in a crisis, but not team players? I have a lot of clients where that happens. C, reluctant to participate in exercises or in the crisis management program. D, don't share their materials or exercise. I have no idea how they would perform. And the last one is our cry for help. So what do you think? How would you evaluate the communications in your organization? All right, so amazing. I love watching the numbers move about. So currently we're at about 50% of them that have a highly skilled, dropping a little, highly skilled and practiced. Next one is helpful in a crisis, but not team players. I find that so consistent. I'm not sure what the personality issues are that make that happen, but it's challenging. And then we have equal change now and reluctant to participate or don't share the materials. That's a huge problem when you look at what we do for a living. And then some people that are just, help. All right. Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, I've talked about a lot of stuff in a short period of time. My goal today is I hope I didn't depress you, but I want you to understand that there is a lot going on in the world. And just because it may be going on in some other place doesn't mean it's not going to impact us pretty directly here in the US. So I think it's important for us, given what we do for a living, to really understand this concept of societal disruptions and the polycrisis issues that we're facing worldwide. So my homework assignment for you is I would really like you to take the information in that we talked about here today, and I would ask you, first of all, is to go back and really look at your program based on the threats that I just shared with you here today. And really ask yourself, based on the societal disruptions, which, by the way, I don't think I shared this with you, that the average length of time for this pandemic hangover called societal disruptions is about 50 years in all pandemics. I'll be long dead before this one's over. This is what I already figured out, right? So that's, this is not going to go away tomorrow. This actually will percolate and grow and turn into lots of other things. So we've got the societal disruptions and we have the polycrisis issues. So go back and look at your program and see if you have what you need, both internally to solve issues, but also the external problems that are likely to come to you. Are you well positioned with the 3 things I talked about? Situational awareness, crisis management, and crisis communications. So that's the first thing I want you to do. Then what I want you to do is I really want you to give a really honest look at your program and really ask yourself about the issue of, are we well prepared with situational awareness? Are we well prepared in order to be able to get information in, validate it, verify it, and display it? Really look at your crisis management, because I will tell you, yes, business continuity is important, but with all the things I talked about here today, what's going to drive that, what's going to manage it, is an effective crisis management program. That's what you have, and that's what you need. And then lastly, the communications piece, which I know most of you are not responsible for, but wow, is that important with all the issues that I talked about here today. And then lastly, what I'd like to say is this, is that I would really encourage you to really work to educate not only yourself on an ongoing basis about many of the issues I talked about here today, but also many people around you. Like, for example, the Global Crisis Report by the World Economic Forum. That should be something that many people in your organization are familiar with, your executives in particular. Circulate that to the right people so that you can actually then use that information to help make sure that you're ready. And I will also say to you that if you're hoping we're going back to 2019, it ain't happening. It's not happening. We're not going back. It's going to be different, whatever that is. And so what I think we all have to do as a profession is continue to work to be as flexible and nimble as we possibly can, because there's a lot going on out there. Which leads to my last thing, which is this. Please take care of yourself. My background, I don't know if you noticed, is originally in the field of nursing many years ago. And so that's that nursey part of me that always wants to check in with people. And so it's important that you actually really think about how you can best take care of yourself, because everybody needs you. Your family needs you, your friends need you, your company needs you. But we need you to be whole. So, take weekends off when you can, and don't stay up all night working on stuff, and get some rest, and eat well. I'm going to sound like your mom, but all those things are important, because we all have to be whole at the end, and that's what I want us all to be. So on that note, I thank you very much for your time. And if I have time for questions, I'll be happy to take it. I have 1 minute, so if there's any questions in 1 minute, I can take them. Let me see. Will they appear before me magically? Maybe, I don't know. Oh, and by the way, if you don't follow me on LinkedIn, I publish tons of stuff like what I talked about here today on a frequent basis, so I can depress you on LinkedIn as I depressed you this morning. I don't have any questions. I only got 40 seconds left, so thank you very much.
Thank you. You're welcome. All right, everybody. Our next general session will begin at 9:15. There's coffee and snacks available behind you, and we'll see you back at 9:15. Good morning. Our next session is going to go ahead and get started. The title of this general session is What Will an Effective, Efficient Operational Risk and Resiliency Program Look Like in 2 to 4 Years? Joining me are my co-panelists, David Sarabacha, Chris Hurst, and Frank Shultz. Come on up. David, we're going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for sticking with us through a good 2.5 or more days, depending on when you started your participation. We appreciate you sticking around till the end. What we want to do this morning is you've heard a lot about what you should do today, tomorrow, or in the near term. What we'd like to turn the focus to here as we near the end of the conference is really what's the future going to look like? What is the indicators and the topics that we think will be on your radar to start funding for and supporting and trying to understand what you can prepare for a couple years out? Now, some of our talk is likely to go beyond 4 years, but I think that's okay because as many of you know who've been doing this for a while, you don't often get funding in 1 year or be able to turn silver bullet solutions, as I like to call it, very quickly. So a lot of the conversation will frame just around future state. And let me stop there and introduce myself, and I'll let the panelists tell you a bit about who they are. I'm Dave Sarabacha. I've been in this space almost 30 years now. This is somewhere around my 20th DRJ show. I started with Bob in Atlanta many, many years ago and have been active throughout the time with all in a professional services capacity. So I've helped well over 150 different clients over the years, initially in more of the disaster recovery space and then moving more into the operational resilience and crisis management, critical event management space. So I'm very excited to bring some of those historical perspectives and using that to kind of look forward on how we see the next 5 to 10 years playing out. And I turn it over to Chris to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, David. Great to be here. So Chris Hurst, graduated from West Point in 2001, spent 5 years as an Army diver, 4 years building infrastructure in Iraq and Afghanistan. Clearly, risk management and security were big components of those roles. Went on to grad school to wrestle with some deep questions about the work in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then was a director of enterprise risk management at Mercy Corps. Actually, Dave and I met there 10 years ago briefly. Then went on to, I faced a lot of challenges in that role, as you can imagine, and went on to start a machine learning AI company that ultimately merged with Onsolve in 2020. And so come from both a risk management practitioner background and also TAC background. Great to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I think Chris and I, we were talking, it's like our third time on a panel together, I think, here.
It's a tradition.
Yeah, hopefully we can keep it entertaining. Frank Shultz with Infinite Blue, started the company almost 10 years ago. Been in the space on the vendor side for almost 20 years now. And I'm a product guy at heart, so if anyone out here used LDRPS 10 at Stroll, I apologize. I was the product manager for LDRPS 10 at Stroll, cut my teeth there in the business continuity and resilience space, and started Infinite Blue about 10 years ago. Product guy at heart, my whole goal is how do we take tech to make it work in a way that helps you when you don't think about the technology. That's my goal in life, about how I think about it.
Good morning, I'm Vanessa Matthews, 15-year career in Homeland Security and Emergency Management, background in aviation, manufacturing, and retail. I've always loved to help companies to build resilience and crisis management programs and the close partnership with security operations. Today I lead Espalus Advisors. We are headquartered in Charlotte. Our 3 verticals are security, emergency management, and all things resiliency and crisis management.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. We very much appreciate it. Lots of experience and diverse experience, so we believe this is a good panel to really talk about some of the varieties in the future. So we're going to try and cover off on 4 broad topics. First is the future of risk. So what are the actual risks we see coming that are either materially different or brand new over the next few years that will give rise to different considerations for your programs? what type of response activities you can start to put in place, get the investment for, and being able to be better able to respond. Because it's easy to sit around and dream about what might happen, but if you don't have a strategy or a plan, there's not a whole lot of point in it, right? That's why we're all here. So we want to talk a little bit about how do you start to get ahead of the game as you hear about those risks and what you can do about it. The third topic is, I'll call it regulation and executive support. Many industries long past banking are starting to see regulations come into play, where in the past it had kind of been just the right thing to do. So we'll talk just a little bit about that, but I think given the panel's experiences and some of the things we talked about preparing for this session, it will be really more about the executive support in saying, well, how do we, in a time of potential or what appears to be an economic downturn, how do we keep the executive support up so all of you have the resources you need, time and money, to do any of this stuff? Because it's great to talk about it, but you need the resources to actually effectively do it. And then the fourth element is really the tech piece. And the tech, I don't mean nobody's up here to do a sales pitch of their tools. We're talking about tech with respect to how will AI, machine learning, quantum computing and the like affect, or will it affect, what all of you do in the next few years. And so that's the topics that we'd like to cover off on. Like all the other sessions that you've participated in, or at least many of them, we have some prepared questions, but we'd also like to hear from you. So if you go ahead and use the app as we go throughout the discussion this morning, if you have questions, go ahead and feed those in, and they'll be provided up to us, and at the end of the session, we'll address a handful of those based on time permitting. So thank you for that, and appreciate your participation this morning. So with that, I'd like to start with really the first question. So what are the greatest risks we see coming over the next 4 or 5 years? I'd like to start with Vanessa on that and have her share where she thinks some of these things are going.
Yeah. So we've been hosting executive roundtables with customers, and one of the reports that we pay attention to is the NC State report. They do a lot of data and research on enterprise risk. So Protiviti and NC State recently released their previous one, the tail end of 2022. They interviewed about 1,400 senior executives and board members. And what I like about the report is they look at the current year plus a decade ahead. So it was really helpful to answer your questions. So there's a few of them that I have in mind. One is that's number one for now as well as for the next decade is talent and culture. From succession planning to retaining top talent, as well as resistance to change. Many companies listed that as one of their top concerns. I think that might shift depending on what it looks like from a generational perspective as generations transition out and new generations transition in and into the workplace. The second thing is emerging innovation and adopting technologies. So there's two types of talent that we have to have. Of course, it's tech talent. So whether you're taking your existing talent and upskilling them to prepare for the technology of our future, or if it's you hiring new talent. But the second thing is that everything from my perspective begins and ends with leadership. And while we have to have tech talent to be innovative and to prepare for the future, none of that happens without leadership. And so who are the people that are going to lead the technical teams and this new wave or this transformation from a business standpoint? Another one is environmental, social, and governance, and the emphasis on social. We have a customer and partner that we work with, and in their particular state, their city is inland. However, they're within a coastal state. And so one of their big concerns is which is more on the environmental side, as water begins to rise on the coastline and people move inward, what are the risks that their city is going to experience? And how does that impact every other aspect of their risk portfolio? So whether it's the roads, the bridges, the school systems, the water, the dependencies that all those people are going to have on their infrastructure is a huge risk that they're paying attention to. And so I think that as people begin to shift and move around, that's going to be something to pay attention to. The other component is when I think about the supply chain and having to substitute products that we might not be accustomed to right now. If the things that we're used to having access to or that we're used to being able to purchase are no longer there, what does that look like? And how does that change the end user and how they're experiencing that product? So I think that's going to be something that business teams and technology teams and operations teams and even sales teams might have to rethink about depending on what continues to happen with with the supply chain and then access to key materials. Last two things I'll end on are geopolitical risks. I think that's going to continue to be a huge problem. Everything that we're hearing is anywhere but China. I don't think that it's probably a great leading strategy, depending on what happens in the U.S. government and where we continue to align or shift who our allies and who our partners are going to be. And then lastly, domestically here in America. That is a big risk and a big challenge, and I think that the more our country continues to move forward, we have to think about how do we close those gaps, because we have to be sustainable, and it's really hard when there's such a difference of opinion, political thoughts, and it creates divisiveness, and it's hard to work together when we're divided. So.
Very good. Thank you, Vanessa. I would like to play off of that real quick, and I know it's dark, but quick show of hands. How many of your organizations are already actively incorporating ESG components into your resilience program? So maybe a third without counting here. At Deloitte, we are absolutely seeing that connection coming more and more within organizations as a set of futuristic risks, if you will, or things that have always been there that we've maybe not addressed, to make sure that those things get built into the program. And obviously thinking about it, not just for what's good for the world, but what's good for your company. So how do these applications and policies and things that are going to come down, what do you need to do to react differently to it? I think Chris has some additional thoughts on the future of risk. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Vanessa, you did a great job going from culture to like inside the organization to kind of social questions, and I'm gonna play into that. So 3 themes that we've seen, and those themes are the rise of dynamic risk, and I'll define that. The second is institutional gaps and challenges. The third is disagreement on the nature of truth. And then all of those lead us to, we are ripe for exploitation from generative AI. And so let me go through those quickly. When the pandemic kicked off, we started noticing a trend where our clients and partners, business continuity, security risk managers, were all saying things like, man, the frequency of events, the volume of events, man, this event changed from here to here, or this event caused another event. The peaceful protest enabled a riot. The tornado caused a power main outage, and that caused an evacuation, a gas leakage, and that caused a school evacuation. So that was kind of our beginning of thinking about dynamic risk. You heard the great presentation from my colleagues Sue and Ann and the Delta team yesterday, where we're now gathering those in a quantitative way. We call that the Global Risk Impact Report. You should certainly download that. The big themes, specifically the themes of the last year, were natural disasters. And you can we use the term end of seasonality. That's a little bit of a stretch, but more frequent, more natural disasters. Second, transportation disruptions was a large theme. You can think of the recent rail disruptions, and there were many more. If you're in our world of data, you know that there was a train derailment in Texas and one in Portland. So transportation. And third is infrastructure disruptions like power grids. So we have these trends that we're seeing in the data. And again, check out our Global Risk Impact Report. The second theme I want to talk about is the institutional trust gap, or institutional, the way that we as a society come together to solve problems. And so think about these assumptions that were generally held, if not explicitly, at least implicitly held, not too long ago, that Ukraine is a stable location to go get some software, to outsource your software engineers, that China is a stable location to single thread your supply chains, that retail locations they're gonna always be open, that electricity will certainly work reliably. And clearly the last few years have proven that those assumptions of stability were not true. And if you think about the way that the institutions that are meant to solve, let's say COVID, like the CDC, how many of you think the CDC is like a well-trusted institution? I see a vast, I see one. I appreciate your bravery. What's happened, in our opinion, in that institutional gap is that we, the private sector and risk leaders and executives at state and local government, we are stepping in to fill that gap. We call that the shift, where general counsels and CEOs who were not trained in COVID, protocols are now having to step in to fill that. There's retail leaders that are stepping in to say, look, are we going to have to board up the store or not board up the store? There's supply chain leaders that were not trained in geopolitics that have to figure out where they're going to shift their, from Seoul, China to others. And so that's the second trend is business leaders, our teams, our executive teams stepping into that gap. The third theme is just disagreement about reality. And you can think about any of the big challenges that we face as a country, and my strong suspicion is that you can think of people who strongly disagree with you about the nature of the reality itself. And that's really, that makes us really vulnerable to generative AI. And I'll give you what I mean by this. We have a client who today, right now, has software in his digital communications team that, with just a few minutes of his CEO's voice, can allow this client, who works on the communications team, to provide amazing messages to the whole company from the voice and the emotion and intonation of a CEO. Did you get that? Generative voice AI can model, this is deepfake, right? So he's using it for good. But now let's say you're nefarious. Rising disruptions, dynamic risk, institutional gaps, business leaders having to step in an uncoordinated way, lack of reality of what's going on. Take last week with the Silicon Valley bank run. You could talk about when that started. Was it interest rates? Let's go all the way to Peter Thiel telling his portfolio investors, hey, I think SVB may have some problems. What if you're nefarious? The technology is available right now to deepfake Peter Thiel, and not just him, but multiple. So those are the risks as I see it. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, trust along with ESG is really all merging into this space that we have right now. Now, one could say trust has been around forever from, say, a consumer products perspective, where you would naturally see that. But now, so many of the surveys that are out there actually show that some of the greatest trusted individuals, if you will, to the person on the street is actually their company, more than government leaders, more than spiritual leaders, more than others who traditionally had been in those roles, just because trust has eroded. And whether you believe those surveys or not, it puts a serious responsibility on the leaders of all of our organizations to have that trust. And you each have a role in that by building the confidence that your job's going to be there, that everyone's job's going to be there, the assets of the company are going to be there, and you're going to be able to sustain through whatever the events are that Vanessa and Chris talked about, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's technological, or whatever drives it. So whichever of those risks kind of rang a bell with you in terms of applicable to your organization as we look forward, I want to kind of turn to, okay, now what? Those are interesting. Maybe you've heard all of them, maybe you've heard some of them, but what do we do about it? What are some of the things that would be the next steps? So we'll turn to Frank here and kind of say, what ideas and thoughts do you have as we look to go, how do we recognize when some of these future risks are upon us or about to be upon us, and what can we do to get ahead of that?
Yeah, look, if I pull on the theme of trust, because I think it's a big one, we could spend an hour talking about trust, right? Which is really important. So Forrester has been advocating probably for about the last year or two to invest or establish a chief trust officer in the organization. Does anyone have a chief trust officer in their company now? I know there's a groundwork of probably about 10 or 15 in large companies. And their guidance is the trust officer should essentially be your CISO in essence. So it's more thinking about zero trust as a policy from a cyber perspective, but then how do you bring people into that circle of trust? So, as Chris said, AI is scary, right? GPT-5 just got released yesterday, I think it was, right? OpenAI. The tool you're talking about, I'll throw the tool out there because go play with it. It's scary. You should know what it does. 11 Labs. If you go to their website and you take a clip and you upload it, you can actually take almost anyone's voice. The intonation is probably 80% there. But I actually took one of my head of alliances was on a cruise, and I took his voice, sampled it from one of our recent videos that was just on a company update, And I basically told our COO in his voice, I'm not coming back until I run out of money. I'm on my cruise for a while now. It sounded a little angrier than I think someone will be on vacation, but it's scary. If you pair that up with Chat GPT, and now I can have something that understands context talking, it's really interesting. But all of this, if we take kind of a zoom out, like I think in terms of systems and themes, much like you kind of went through, Chris, how do we prepare for the thing that we don't know, right? So we can talk about, these are the risks that are predicted. Here's what we think, where we think we're going. There are themes of trust. There are themes of technology. And the answer hasn't been build a higher wall. And sometimes we think about that. We're like, we're going to, we have stronger firewalls. We're going to put better endpoint protection. We're going to just keep building the wall up higher. We're going to make this building a fortress. And if you look what happened recently, LastPass had a breach, I think last week, or it was announced last week. We'll see when it actually occurred. Their breach was from somebody running a Plex video streaming server inside their home network. That was a developer that had the master encryption keys, and they hacked through the Plex connection into the developer's laptop on his home network. How many people have employees working at home? All of you. What's your mandate for people working at home for a security perspective? So there's some shared responsibility. I think we have to basically do a couple things. I think, understanding the risks that we're aware of, the things that we're not aware of, and kind of set up almost these trip lines or trap doors so we very quickly understand from publicly available data, from private data in the organization, when things are kind of in an anomalous state. Because it's really hard to kind of say, like, okay, we're just going to wait for the hurricane cone to come through. That we see a little farther out. A tornado is something we can't see as far out. We have to be really quick on the response there. So establishing protocols, establishing a way to kind of hit that tripwire, and then I know we're going to talk about training later, but having people be able to have that muscle memory of response. So if I'm home working and my laptop locks up with a malware screen, who do I call? I should know that before I need to go call somebody, right? Like immediately, here's who I notify and here's the protocol in anything there. So a lot of it is just establishing general, I think, a baseline of what our response should be so we can react more quickly. But it's really hard to say we're only going to account for risk A, B, and C because that's what we think. The other part is the availability bias. We're all planning for the last disaster we experienced. A telecom company had I think another cyber attack or data breach last fall, and you went on their website and they had 30 jobs for cybersecurity posted the next day. We're responding to the last event. That's probably not what's going to get us.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick fire, just to get your opinions on this. Event neutral versus scenario planning. Vanessa?
Event neutral.
Event neutral.
Neutral.
Right? Neutral. Yep. Okay.
Yep.
I think that's still more or less consensus. Get event neutral and then move into scenarios because of what Frank was talking about, right? If you only plan for what you most anticipate, you're likely to experience something else. But I think one of the key factors is what does event neutral actually mean? Because if event neutral is then still too generic, you still don't have a lot of value for the operations and the technicians who have to actually execute on your response plan. So it's about going in depth on that. Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, to frame my answer to this, I want to tell you about Stan. Stan is a real life, I'm changing his name because some people might know Stan. Stan is a security director at a manufacturing company, and he told me, he said, listen, I got handed business continuity management last year, and what I did, I know I have to create these plans, so told all the business unit leaders to create the plans, and they'll send it back to me later this year. And clearly, there are some problems with that, and it's related to detection. Clearly, the process of sitting down with business unit leaders and asking the what-if questions does two things. It develops a mindset for risk, but it also, to your point, lets you know who's in the game, right? Like, it builds those relationships. The way that we both detect and respond to risk internally is through those relationships that our employees are sensors. They need to know who we are in business continuity and risk and security. They need to know that, like, see something, say something, and I mean that from like a bag at the airport, that's kind of, but also to like, hey, I had a client yesterday who was like, listen, we've got a lot of BPO in the Philippines. What if Philippines shifts more to China? That's a bit, so that's like having an avenue to gather that information internally and then an avenue to respond out. I think the collaboration comes from relationships. Now we're all working from home. You got to lean in even harder there. That's on the process side. On the tech side, there's so much information out there, right? So millions and millions. We did a study that it said if you processed what an analyst would have to process, it would be like reading like 20 War and Peaces every day. There's just too much information, and this is where I do believe AI and machine learning can really help filter out. Most of that's completely irrelevant, but can begin. Historically, AI, ML, machine learning was used to label, what is this piece of text about? Is it about a shooting, or is it about a movie being shot? And not tell clients about the movie being shot, but do tell them about the shooting. Where is it happening? What street corner? When did it happen? 2 years ago? Did it just happen? So that's where AI ML can really help in parsing through. So hopefully that was good. The collaboration internally with relationships, and then using tech to support our people as sensors.
Yeah, I would say data turning into information as a broad statement is key to this. So as an industry, I think we've come a long way with more predictive analytics and the ability to gather data that's out there to kind of see what may be coming or what's happening right now and be able to react faster. I think the next stage will be how much we can automate the response. Not just technically, but I'm talking about operationally. How many things can we speed up in the ability to respond because we don't have to talk about it and get into command centers and have meetings and more conference calls and point person A to B to figure out what to do. That to me is where we need to get to next, and in a detailed enough manner that it works for your organization. Not just, we're going to transfer work, and work from home is laughable, right? 10 years ago, that was what everybody talked about, not anymore. So really getting enough information and creating a repository of what those capabilities and strategies are, so that in the future, a plan or a playbook is nothing more than an output, very customized for the situation. So to me, that's taking it from event neutral. So I've gathered a bunch of data. So instead of a BIA, I can actually run a query that says, this is what happened, what's that impact teeing up to be? Now I can go ahead and immediately start to execute as much automated response as possible. That, I think, is where we need to get to next. So it's not just your brain power, your colleagues' brain power, trying to put all this stuff in a relatively static database with PDFs or whatnot. I know a lot of people are farther than that, but at the end of the day, sometimes what I see still is a relatively uneventful document that tends to be more of a compliance document than an actual capable document. Well, suggestion in terms of response is always test, test, test more than you do anything else, even if you fail miserably, because it forces people to learn and pay attention. Everything else feels like a process. You must do a BIA, you must write your plan, you must update your plan. Okay, fine, but let's see if it works. And so we often suggest our clients work backwards in the cycle of whether you have circles, squares, chevrons for your methodology, I don't care what it looks like. Ultimately prove what you're capable of, so no matter what the event is we talked about in terms of a future risk, you have the best information available in this repository to use what I hope will be AI and ML to actually direct more quickly to what in that data is relevant so that I can respond faster. We turned from recovery to resilience many years ago in terms of a word, but I still think we're challenged to effectively actually get to that. And that requires each and every one of you working with your operational teams or your tech teams, because whatever industry you're in, those frontline folks are the folks who have to execute this stuff. You're there to coach them, guide them, support them, prepare them. But if they're not using it, obviously limited value. And so we need to really get that forwarded, I think, in terms of response capabilities. Now, what do you need to do that? I'll move to the next topic and briefly hit on, in order to get the resources you need, those in a regulated industry or to be regulated industry, obviously it helps getting those resources. What we want to just talk about is we're starting to see more outside just FSI in terms, which is financial services and insurance, in terms of requirements coming forth. Vanessa, you want to share just a couple of thoughts with respect to what you see coming in terms of that?
So a couple of thoughts. The U.S. federal government is a huge buyer, right? And when there's supply chain interruptions, it affects our government. So I do think that there is the potential for more regulations or requirements to help control as much as they can the volatility from a supply chain perspective. And then to your point, when you add a train derailment, it adds even more complexities. The other thing I think that's important is from an ESG perspective, the Germany Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, depending on how complex your supply chain is, what countries you're operating in, governments are starting to really pay attention to what's happening within our supply chain, and then how are we as companies being more diligent about those things. It's unfortunate that there's good and that there's bad, but when we're moving product back and forth, at the same time, people are moving people back and forth. And so how do we reduce the risks of human trafficking and some of the issues that we're seeing from a global standpoint? And so I think that will probably continue as time goes on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think whether you are in an industry where you're going to get hit with more regulations or not, ultimately what we like to talk about is executive support. The higher up you're in the organization, the more resources you're likely to get, no matter how far down in the organization your particular group may sit. So what are some of the thoughts, in terms of how do you do something maybe different than has historically been done to get additional executive support? Say, Frank, from, if you were out there in the field as a corporate planner.
Yeah, look, I think the biggest thing, I'm a huge advocate of taking corporate objectives and aligning your resilience program and helping executives understand, here's how we're going to backstop these corporate objectives through our program for resilience. And so if we look at risk assessments, or we look at, again, this is the things that we can predict, how can we try to mitigate those to the point where we're going to hit our revenue goals, we're going to hit our expansion goals, we're going to hit whatever goals we have from a corporate perspective. I become really valuable as a resilience professional if I can help my executives achieve what they need to achieve. That's what they're there for. They're there to deliver results, right? And so that becomes really powerful from an executive support perspective. A lot of times, unfortunately, what will happen is a big event occurs, and now the attention's on somebody because they were like, hey, we got to figure out, we never really broke the glass to figure out what's behind it, but now we have to. Hey, Chris, can you help us do this recovery? Like, thank you for that. In reality, it's like the other part of that is how do you take day-to-day activities and make sure you have awareness there, right? So like I think about resilience, the pivot for me from kind of the business continuity and disaster recovery to resilience, as we've talked about it really over the last year or two, it's about the day-to-day. How do I think about how to keep the business running instead of planning for the next big one, right? So I think those two things together, so there's awareness I'm building every day for every event, whether it's critical or not, and I'm aligning to the corporate goals. Now I'm making my executives stars, right? Now I'm basically saying, hey, I'm supporting you directly. I'm making sure you can achieve what you told your board you're going to achieve. That seems to work really well.
Yeah, it's. I was just thinking as you were saying that, sitting in this room, whatever it was, 30 years ago in Atlanta, and my comment earlier around, say, BIA plans test as kind of a very simple model of what everyone does. One shift I have seen more and more in the last few years, and is absolutely the right shift, and we obviously work with all our clients on it, is using a journey approach. So when you say I'm going to do BIAs and plans, against what? Against an organizational hierarchy? Against a site? Are you really looking at all the dependencies properly? We've talked about dependencies for 30 years. You got a space in all your tools to put in, this is dependent upon that. But is it ever complete? Because in most instances that I've dealt with real responses, and this maybe is easier to see on the technology application side, is take an SAP implementation, you've got your finance and accounting and controllership folks at the back end of that cycle, and tax tables didn't come in. They can't do anything in terms of SAP. So to just go, it's just SAP, it's not just SAP. And that's just a simple example, but my point is mapping out precisely what that end-to-end value chain or journey or whatever you prefer to use as a term, and then doing these different practices against it. So you're not double counting money. I've seen terrible situations where people do a BIA, they go get support, find out that they're double and triple counting the impacts because in fact they didn't quite realize that that was the same dollar moving through a value chain. Seems obvious, but believe me, it happens when everybody gets out there and kind of segments their program into these different pieces and parts. Putting those all together are key. One other comment I would make is We have a program that doesn't matter what you call it, it's called Signature Issues within our organization that we work with companies on, which is then applying the risks and the capabilities that the 3 panel members talked about to that journey. And why is that important? Because if you do it right, it's much more sustainable as you merge and acquire other companies, as you maybe divest, as you grow into other countries and other processes, other products. You have a visualization. You've got the risks laid on it. You've got the response capabilities laid on it. And you will be less likely to miss that interface, that third party, that component, because everybody gets the big stuff, better or worse. That's the easy part. The question is, are you going to miss something that completely stops that critical process from happening? And I think having that visualization comes back to some of the data discussions. And to Frank's comment about executives and how you get their support, focus on what they want, of course. Go look at the financial statements, go talk to them or their direct reports. What are they focused on in the budget this year? Make sure your plans are in that same arena. Don't go off and say, well, we're dreaming about this because we heard it in the news, right? It's like, let's focus specifically on exactly what they're looking at. It goes beyond just your blockbuster product if you're consumer products or a pharmaceutical company where you have an obvious one. It's really looking across at, actually, we're very concerned about a geopolitical event in a certain country. Do we really know how fast we can get out of there? We helped a couple of organizations leave Russia in the current environment here about a year ago now, I suppose it was, a year and a half. But you may be surprised the limitation of data that your organization has with how fast they can see that. And then you pile rules on top of that where the government says, well, I can provide service on this product, but I can't sell new ones. So now I have to have parts to be able to do that in the country, but I got to get everything else out of the country. Being able to respond like that with data and information from your teams rather than saying, oh, that's an operational problem and we don't really get into that, that's exactly where you're going to get better respect, more resources, and be able to advance what you're trying to achieve. So the data, we'll always come back to data and information, is if you can be that central hub, and you can call it a data lake, you can call it whatever you want, I don't care, but make sure that you have access to that so that you can provide those insights back and are not seen as kind of a necessary evil of the organization. Chris?
David, yeah, I'm gonna give a couple themes and then a framework that might help. Just show of hands. Do you happen to know? Raise your hand if you know the hourly revenue of your company. I see massive hands. Actually, I do see it. So why did I ask that question? A couple weeks ago, we were talking to a business continuity director of a large retail organization. He asked me, he said, Chris, I love this solution. I love what you can do. I need finance team approval. And we said, okay, what have been the challenges? He said, well, for me, I care about, severe weather and fire. Just got it. That's common retail organization. Have there been any incidents? Well, I just really need to know more about severe weather and fire. Okay. Fine. What keeps you up at night? Well, arson. Okay, that's related to, why arson? Well, there's been a string of arson. Oh, there's a string of arson. What happens when there's arson? Well, at the store level, a store manager ends up manually calling the whole process. They manually call me, they manually call the police, they manually call their 200 associates when it's time to come back to work per store. Like, man, that seems really slow, is it? Oh yeah, man, it takes like a whole day to call these people. Okay, what's the impact of that? Well, turns out, so this is where revenue comes in. Just to keep the math easy, each store earns about $100,000 of revenue every day. Fixing an arson response can take 2 weeks. So you can think, just $1 million. How long does it take you within that to call people to figure out when you're going to reopen the store? Oh, about a day. I'm like, dude, you had 100,000, how many arson events? Oh, it's been 10. There's $1 million of revenue from just this one risk that's at risk because of the lack of automation. So that was a long story to say, tie your metrics back to value wherever you can. I'm gonna quote a couple other people here at the audience. I'll use first names just to protect them, but I spoke with David. There's many Davids here, so we'll protect this. But David said, look, Chris, people in our industry and business continuity and risk managers, we have a heart to serve, but we're terrible salespeople. Mm-hmm. And that can really limit us, right? It can limit us in the organization to get the thing done that we know needs to get done. So Allison, as an answer to this, Allison said, Chris, you got to use crises. Like when crises happen to us, that's the time to make the point that we need help. Don't put it all on my shoulders, right? Like I need help, I need resources. And so that helps move our executives' animal brains is during those crises. Anne Marie was one of my colleagues in Don, I'm going to mispronounce Don Grazina's class yesterday. She and I were in a workshop, and we talked about how to use metrics to help with executive support. So one way to use metrics is to show we're green across the board. We're green in the number of business continuity plans and our percent RTO to RT, we're green. Another way to use metrics is to really highlight the gaps. And I think highlighting those gaps can really help you in the metrics. So what do I mean by those gaps? It's like number of key takeaways from the last exercise that have not been accomplished, right? The high-risk items that have not moved forward. All right, so those are some of the themes, and I'll finish here with a framework. About 10 years ago, I learned a framework called the Adaptive Leadership Framework, and it goes like this. So far, what we're talking about, with any problem, organizations face two challenges. The first challenge is a technical challenge, like what's the right answer? And kind of that's what DRJ is about, the right answer. There is a right technical solution, whether it's literally technology or process, there is an answer. But then there's an adaptive challenge, and that's how does a big organization with business continuity teams and HR teams and legal teams and ESG teams and security and risk, everyone with slightly different motivations and incentives, and I'm going to retire in a year, I don't want to take this on, and I'm going to, like different motivations. How do we move forward to get to the right answer? The analogy is that someone may have gangrene on an arm, and the right answer may be an amputation. But if the doctor just comes in and amputates and doesn't do the adaptive work, it's a disaster, right? So the solution to the adaptive challenge is something called the balcony. And the balcony is where you step away from the challenge and you mentally think to yourself, like, I'm going to get off the dance floor where people are dancing, and by dancing I mean like they're interacting to solve their challenges, to go about, and what is the business unit's motivation? What is their deep person, and how do you build informal alliances to deeply solve those challenges? Adaptive leaders will rise in organizations. Non-adaptive leaders will get stuck within their silo. So.
Yeah, that's great. I'll maybe sum it up in something if you want. You can write down in three simple bullets in terms of interpretation of what Chris said, and what one of the models that we built in terms of metrics with one of the largest global tech companies out there. It's number one is the metrics. I'm pretty confident every one of you does. This is the counts of things that you just have to support the amount of work you do. The problem is a lot of organizations stop there. So consider that the traditional metrics. I did 50 BAAs, 100 plans, whatever, okay? The interesting part is number two and number three. Number two is risk coverage. So to Vanessa's comments about ESG and Frank's and Chris's around trust, including that type of thing is along with enterprise risk management, GRC, whatever else you have in terms of risk programs, and say, of my capabilities, what risk do I actually have covered? So it kind of brings that event neutral concept to the table and starts going, okay, if I have these scenarios, do I really have enough detailed content to address them when it comes at me for real and not in this generic model? So the measure there is ultimately a percentage of coverage. So I've got a value chain that, it's supply chain, make my product, distribute it, or whatever. I'm now going to apply the risks we talked about, the customer trust aspects of that, and go, I've got 50% coverage. Now next year I've invested a little more in X, Y, and Z, I've got 70% coverage. Why is that important? That kind of risk talk rises to the executive level. It's a little better than just saying I did 50 plans, I did 60 this year, so therefore I'm great, right? What did I achieve? Second is the risk coverage. And the third is what we call recovery confidence, or sometimes executive confidence. And that comes to taking those journeys and testing them end to end, really demonstrating what works and what doesn't work. So as Chris said, gap analysis, you're still going to have gaps in that. That is kind of the measurement. So if you say we're going to do 10 of those critical journeys as our mission for the next 5 years or whatever it is, because these are big, these are not simple exercises. You'd be able to use that on a progression dashboard or whatever you like, to be able to show why your work is actually improving the executive recovery level confidence. the coverage is increasing of what you're actually prepared for. And oh, by the way, yes, we are still doing a lot of work because that's kind of table stakes. I thought that was a very good way to kind of advance executive support, tie it back to what they're doing. And if you do it in a dashboard model, you can share it with them as often as they want. You can put it on an intranet page, and in theory, people can go to it. However you do it is up to you. But it sends a very quick message, a fairly easy one to get your arms around, as opposed to just getting into these counts of things that don't have a lot of meaning for people.
Yeah, Dave, I was going to say, as you talk about dashboards, and Chris mentioned them too, I think it's important to understand in your organization how dashboards are perceived. Because I think Alan Mulally, who was the CEO of Ford and I think Boeing before then, there's a great podcast I listened to that he went on and he talked about his system of every week looking at dashboards. And Ford, before he came in, he'll say was a culture of you never have a yellow or a red or you're doing something wrong. Like you don't bring a yellow into a meeting, right? You definitely do not bring a red. And he turned it around and he said, you know what, like we're gonna celebrate the yellows because we're gonna get a problem-solving team to figure out how to get it to green, which is a culture shift. So if you're bringing a dashboard in, I think understanding your organization what it really means, because you wanna be able to bring a yellow or a red and have it be worked and not have it be, oh, you know what, Dave, you didn't do what you needed to do, it's red, like, what's going on? It's just I think you got to read the room, right, and understand your corporate culture to understand how do you move the needle in the right direction.
I guess that's the micro version of trust. You have to trust each other in your own organization to want to get better, and it's okay to fail because you're not failing on purpose, you're failing to improve. And that cannot be, okay, you're out of here. We need, there has to be a resource, a benefit to that, and say, now we're going to build that because we thought we had it and we don't. Sometimes that's time frame. We might have a capability, but it's going to take us 10 times as long to execute. Okay, what can we do to shrink that window of time? Let me take that into the world of training and awareness. My experience over many years of this is a lot of it becomes fairly superficial, and the practical aspect is what comes out of exercises, simulation, training, and war games. So whether you merge those two and say training and awareness are integrated with testing or exercising, I suggest you should. Doesn't mean you can't have an awareness program, a month, disaster month and the like to get broad awareness. But ultimately, and you probably all felt this throughout the sessions over the last 2.5 days, is when you're forced to get your hands dirty and do a simulation. I know many of you were in a simulation the other day. It forces your brain to engage, right? And you can sit and do training and watch PowerPoints go by and whatever, and honestly, how much does that give a lot of folks, especially if it's not training they need to use in the very near term? So what I want to turn to is, what do you all see as maybe the future of training that gets more substantive value to the organization? We'll start with you, Vanessa.
Okay. Well, there's a couple things. So back to the executive support. I'm a firm believer that our clients tell us what business we're in. So whether you're a consultant, whether you're a vendor partner, or whether you're in the business, there's two questions that we always ask: what's urgent versus what's important? Because if it's urgent, you'll move resources, you'll move things around, you will make a commitment. If it's important, we'll have a meeting about a meeting about a meeting. And so that leads into, what are the urgent things that we need to be exercising, that we need to be testing? And so I'll take it from a people perspective and a sustainability perspective, and I'll let my colleagues share a different approach. I'm a firm believer that there has to be consistency. We have to create muscle memory. I don't know many companies that pulled out their playbook in COVID. Some did, a lot did not. And so I think it's unrealistic to think that we probably walk around with a booklet. I carry the iPad. But honestly, it's taking years of experience and asking the experts and the stakeholders around the table for us to come forward with the solution that's going to work for whatever the issue is that we're solving. But to that end, what I think is important from a training perspective is the need to go vertical and horizontal. So if I'm supporting a business continuity manager or lead or whatever the title is, who's the person that's above them? Who's the person that's below them, and who are the people that are to their right and their left that they influence, that they work with, that they impact every single day? And then if you take a step further, so let's say one of those roles is facilities. Who's the person that's above, below, right, and left? And what I find is that we're seeing customers that do a one and done, or their training program is very inconsistent. And so the problem with that is that as people change, as roles change, as tech companies do layoffs, the capabilities, the support, the people who get it in the business continues to go away. And so I think that it's important that we build a strategy and a framework or a system to hit the key players. And so that way, as things change, as the chess pieces move, you still have people who understand and who get it at every level of the business. We work with multiple tiers of leadership, from general counsels to chief technology officers who may be a CTO, but you don't really know technology, but you're a great leader. And many of them often don't know their role from a resiliency or a crisis management perspective. And so I think that that piece is important to make sure that we have the muscle memory and that there is consistency within the business.
Totally. I think if all your training is focused more on operations, whether it's technical operations or just pure operations, as opposed to it being seen, again, as kind of a compliance exercise. I would also tell you, kind of back to my 3 metrics of counting risk coverage and confidence, a lot of times that testing still kind of falls in that first bucket. So whether it's testing or training, you're getting a repeat of kind of the same thing year after year. Well, it worked before, and it's like, yeah, are you really testing anything new? Or is there 2 or 3 people different? But essentially, it's the same exercise. And so I already know it until you retire, move on from the company or whatever. Bringing back testing and training as an integrated concept and going end to end, to me, is where you get that practical, your hands dirty. And the other key, to Chris's comment earlier around gaps in that, is so you're training people and you're testing it, you get this gap report. I can't tell you how many places I've gone over 30 years where I can probably ask 4, 5, 6 years later, they can pull out the same gap report they had 6 years ago because no one's acting on it. It's just not getting the attention. We're tracking it, it's there, but it's still not rising to the top. There has got to be a mechanism, and I suggest to you it's this 3-point dashboard or metrics or any of the way a panelist discussed it, to say that message has to get up there. So if you, leadership team, give me an extra $5 million or $100,000, whatever is applicable to your organization, to mitigate these 2 gaps, having the data to say, and this is actually what it's going to do for you. And even more so today than it has been in the past. We've been having some conversations over the last 2 days. A lot of insurance deductions or reductions in your premiums are happening more than ever with real capabilities in all this space. It's been talked about for plenty of years, but it wasn't significant enough. Now I'm seeing it significantly. Now, yes, cyber plays a big role in that versus property and casualty, but why not play off of that unless it's completely out of your particular scope because you only do the BC side of the house within your world. But I just suggest to you that can be a source of funds and executive visibility to advance your program if you haven't discussed that with your risk management insurance related teams. Want to turn to cyber, I guess, with that, if we could. Obviously, that's been at the top of everyone's agenda, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on what's next as we look around, with the preponderance of cyber attacks. Every industry is being hit. There's nobody that can avoid this. There's plenty of discussion, data vaults, immutable copies, and the like within the tech space. By the time the good guys, I'll put us all in that category, catch up to the bad guys, the next thing is there. What do you all see as we continue, the tech shops try to get those assets in place to be able to recover anywhere near fast enough in a cyber event? Do you kind of see what's next, or what should we be thinking about with respect to cyber?
I'll just hit a brief point here. Recovery is clearly critical. Release is also really important when we think about ransomware, right? So backups help us with recovery. That's important, but the threat to release. And so it can have significant impact on our reputation and the reputation in the market. And so thinking through the motivations of, is it a nation state actor who tends to go after industries like ours, and there's certain motivations that they have, or is it criminal, which tend to be more financial? So aligning your approach to industry risks.
Yeah. And I know, Vanessa, you had mentioned cyber isn't necessarily your focus area, but I would bring it up to you with the context of this, because what I'm seeing cyber do for the business continuity folks is advancing the operational capabilities in a way they never have before. So you may look at a BIA, a particular process or value chain, and say, well, our recovery time needs to be 8 hours, and we've planned for that for 5 years, and isn't that wonderful? Now cyber happens, and your IT team says, we're looking at a week or two for everything within that value chain to come back. Well, what do you do now? Was it really a recovery time that was that tight, or all of a sudden you're still going to be in business but a little more pain if you have the cyber attack? Yeah. So were you exaggerating your requirements originally, or are you in a really bad spot and you actually need to enhance that operational capability to maybe last even 2 to 3 weeks, depending on your circumstances? Any thoughts on what you're seeing in that space?
I echo that. I think most companies will tell you that they have a strong cyber team and that those capabilities are where they need to be. But oftentimes when you dig into the details, whether it's legal, whether it's human resources, whether it's marketing, whether it's operations, many department leads and organizational functions don't really know what's the contingency if this happens, and how will they continue to run their business and their function for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, et cetera. So it typically just does not get filtered down into the business, and I think that ties back to training and the need to work vertically and horizontally. I feel like today we're talking about a lot of great strategies and tools, but I don't know about you all, but oftentimes what I see is clients are still very basic of what they need. And it's not a bad thing, right? I think simplicity is helpful, especially in today's world. You talked about how much information is coming our way. It's the simple things, it's the basic things that is still needed, because the level of maturity that we're seeing from Fortune 500s to middle market companies where we typically play at, that's the gap. So that need for consistency, the need for communication, we talked about some of the key performance indicators. While metrics and dashboards are great, what our clients are seeing is, if I walk in the airport or if I walk in a retail company, the level of maturity is not there, and I know that because the conversation isn't there. We don't call the thing the same thing. Mm-hmm. So literally, it's very simple, functional. We can't have chairs without the stage, right? It's the foundation that we're still finding that many companies are still working through, and what's changing it are great leaders. So we work with a airport, and one of the leaders said, my legacy when I leave this airport will be a strong emergency management program, period. For years, the company has operated in terms of, if there's a plane crash, then we activate the EOC. So what has happened is now you have a group of concessionaires, a group of construction workers, a leadership team who doesn't understand or doesn't know the need to, well, why would we launch it? Why would we call this team in? They don't do it. So now you don't have a practice, you don't have a muscle memory, and if you're a top 10 airport in the world, well, that might be a challenge, right? Especially if one of your hubs is a huge airline, right? So it's literally, it's having the right people at the table and the right leaders that can help to spread that influence, and people who come in to say, emergency management, business continuity, resiliency will be my legacy. And while these tools are important, how do we make sure that the mindset and the culture shift continues to happen within the business?
Yeah, Vanessa, if I can tag onto that, I think you hit a couple key points, like use it every day. It's not break the glass in case something happens. And when you do that, you're actually exercising, you're actually using it, and you're changing the way that people think about it. And it's I gotta be honest, nothing drives me more crazy than a tabletop exercise where we sit there when we read through the tasks, and that's all we do. Exercising, in my mind, is you're creating muscle memory for what you do when something happens. So if you use it every day, the EOC is always active, and we're always handling things. If it's a lost child in the airport, that's handled in the EOC as much as a plane crashes. So how do you put that in place every day? And I think that's the pivot. My colleague Andy did the session on operational resilience coming from the Bank of England. Half the people I saw their eyes kind of go, oh no, I have more work to do. Like I have to track things before an event now and kind of predict them, and they're asking me to measure more. But I think that's not what they're asking, right? I think the ask here is stop planning for an event that might not occur and instead be more in the moment. And so how do we pull people back to be able to have the capabilities to recover anything?
Yep.
Use it every day. Be more resilient up front, and let's stop doing a data center recovery test because the regulation needs it, and we never actually open that plan when something actually goes wrong, because it's never the entire data center that fails. It's some small part, and so we go call somebody up and say, what do we do?
Yeah.
It's just a little different pivot. I think that's the pivot that we're on right now, and we're trying to figure out which side we want to end up on.
Yeah. To my 2-3 week comment in terms of being able to operate in that type of event, if I generalize and say the number one thing is data. Okay, going to Vanessa's comment earlier around folks who are good at resilience, maybe know the business, are starting to move on. The generations coming up younger than me, I'll just put it that way, are nearly 100% tech dependent. So when you say I'm going to do a manual operation, that's pretty much hands up in the air, right? I have no idea what you're talking about. And maybe it's impossible because of the volume. It probably is. But if you focus on the key stuff, the only way to do that is to have data. So my point there is it's not enough to write a procedure list. You need to have access to the critical data so that if step 4 says go check on this and do this, there's a place to go check on it. What is it? And that what that typically means is a data extract from whatever critical data you have. So while IT is trying to get the rest of it back, the manual procedure can actually do something. Whether you're in healthcare, a lot of the healthcare breaches folks talked about were nobody knows how to do charting anymore. So the CFOs of hospitals are concerned, we can't bill for anything. We might be able to do patient care, but we're going to go out of business because we can't pay our doctors and nurses. Manufacturing, people say, well, we'll just keep manufacturing. Good luck in most manufacturing environments with no system whatsoever before you run into a problem. There's not material on the front end, the machines aren't operating properly or whatever. So point is, data in those procedures are key. I think we've reached the end of our time here together this morning, and as usual, I talk too much, so didn't get to questions from the audience, but we're all certainly willing to take some offline or connect with anybody as you want after the session, and appreciate all of your time, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
So before our next session begins, if you are here for the final general session, there will be a prize for you to win to include a 2024 free conference pass. There's also an option for an iPad 9th generation, Bose Quiet Comfort 45 headphones, and an Ember temperature controlled coffee tea mug. So if you're back at 10:30, we will do that. And then you can meet Bob Arnold after the last general session to pick up your prize. So have to be here to win. See you soon. Okay, welcome back to our final session. And it is time to draw the names of winners. So the first 3 people that are here, you win. So we're gonna make this super simple. So if you hear your name, please yell. If you don't yell, I'm gonna go to the next, okay? And please forgive me in advance if I mispronounce your name. Michael Giblin. Okay? Guy Harris. Lizzie Ladone. Lizzie. Is Lizzie here? She's here? No, we got Guy Harris over here. Guy Harris. Okay, you are winner number 1. Congratulations. Give him a hand. If you go see Bob Arnold, he's sitting on the far left at the very end of this 9th session. He'll give you your prize, but you can stay where you are at the moment, and at the very end, Bob Arnold will be in the back, and he will help to navigate our prizes. All right, Colleen Hayes. Here, awesome, same. Thank you, Colleen, for sticking around. All right, Wesley Decker. Sadesh? Sadesh from Pfizer? Oh, okay, all right. Stella Ryan. Yay, go Stella. All right, well, congratulations. You guys are gonna win something. You can go ahead and gift me the iPad, and I'm gonna gift it to the Liberty Mutual team. So we're gonna go ahead and introduce our next panel. The title of this session is Winning Together with Purpose, Liberty Mutual's Resilience Transformation Journey, and I'm going to bring up our moderator for this session, Ashley Goosman. She's the risk manager for Liberty Mutual. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to have the team come up because they're going to introduce themselves. So come on, guys. Really excited to be with you all today. Thank you. Great. Well, we're so excited. I'm so excited to look out over this crowd and to see all of you here to help us to round out the conference today. And we hope this will be a capstone for everything that you've been learning over the last few days. We're really thrilled and excited to be able to talk about our journey and really give you a bird's eye view and a little more in-depth, deeper dive into our resilience journey at Liberty Mutual. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We also hope that you'll participate. I know you guys all know by now about our CVent app. We do have some polls we'll be doing throughout. And then we hope you'll have some questions for us at the end because we have some Liberty merch to give you. So before we do get started, I do want to introduce my team members. So we're going to start with Joyce Witham. And if you can give a brief bio, Joyce?
Sure.
To get started.
Sure. Joyce Witham. I've been with Liberty for just about 30 years. The first half of my career was spent in safety and risk control, consulting with our Fortune 500 customers. And the last 15 years or so, I've been focused internally in risk management on safety, business continuity, and anything else they want to throw my way. Ziba?
Go ahead, Ziba.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. My name is Ziba Nekooie, and I am a IT professional. Have been all throughout my career with 25 plus years of experience in a private and public sector. I've joined Liberty Mutual about 11 years ago, and initially I started with business application systems development, managing those systems as well as infrastructure upgrade. Later on, moved into project related to integration as a result of acquisitions, which we do that continuously. About 7 years ago, I kind of fall onto DR and business continuity program, and been managing the DR program for one of our markets referred to as global risk management, with a footprint of, as a global footprint, spans from North to South Americas, Europe to Australia to Asia and Middle East. That Michelle?
Michelle.
So I am Michelle Light. I am the Resiliency process owner globally. So I started at Liberty Mutual more focused on business continuity and crisis with Joyce and Ashley here. And then I've ultimately combined both BC, DR together. Before Liberty, I worked at a utility. So the snowstorm that's going on in the Northeast, I'd be sitting in a bunker talking about what's going to happen and how the technology was going to handle it. But luckily I'm here in Orlando to share what we've been doing for the last 10 years at Liberty Mutual to kind of bring the journey forward and, you know, mature our programs, which is what we're all here for.
Excellent. And Ashley Goosman. So I specialize in business continuity and particularly crisis management for our global business continuity team that Joyce and I are on. I started off with the Red Cross after 9/11, then moved into the public side with the Department of Mental Health in Massachusetts as the Director of Emergency Services, and joined Liberty Mutual over 11 years ago now in the global business continuity team. And so I just wanted to share with you before we really dive in and get started, this came from a brainstorm that Ziba, Michelle, and I had at the fall conference DRJ last year. And so we really thought we had a great story to tell you about our resilience journey. So I know you guys want to hear more about that. I'm going to move us forward. You guys all know the directions for the polls. So we're going to start off with a poll right now so that you can get to know us a little bit later, better if you don't already. But how many countries does Liberty Mutual operate in today? If you can take a guess at that, or if you know the answer, we'll see how that goes. Excellent, so we've got some answers coming in. All right. All right.
They think we're a lot bigger than we are.
Yeah, yeah, actually. So we're actually in 29 countries today across the world, but thank you guys for giving us an even bigger footprint than we think we have. So it's still changing a little bit. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for participating in that, and we wanted to share a little bit more with you about our work and what we're all about today. So we've heard insurance companies talked about a lot over the last few days, but we're going to give you a little more in depth, and so I'm going to hand it off to Joyce to share that.
I just want to share with everybody, I'm a little bit of the troublemaker of the group, so I've got all this energy, so if you see me jump up and sit down, I already warned them in advance that I would be doing this. So just a little bit about our companies. You've probably heard our commercials, you've seen, you know, we're this big company. But I think what's really important, what's really relevant for what we're talking about today is our mission is that we exist to provide our customers with that peace of mind. And that means that our product is our promise to the customer. So you can see where I'm going from a business continuity standpoint and how important that is. So we exist to provide people with that peace of mind, and that's delivered through our people. And so our people are absolutely critical. If you want to
go forward. Yep.
Great. So, and of course we love working here because we love working with Limu and Doug, but it's actually more than that. We're a company that embraces equity and inclusion to really bring out the best in our people, because we know that throughout all of this, our people are really our most important asset. So some of the themes that were talked about at this, like earlier this morning, they said number one, when something happens, you think about what's going on with your people, how safe are your people. That's absolutely true for us because they are our most important asset.
Yep. And we have over 50,000 or about 50,000 employees across the world today. So that's definitely, and our contractors as well, and visitors and customers are always our first concern when events happen.
So,
awesome. Thank you. And now we're going to hand it over to Michelle.
So I'm going to be a little Doug here. Do you remember, we keep hearing about how many plans we have, and plans are good. But when I started here 10 years ago, Ashley and Joyce probably weren't my favorite people because we had a lot of documents. We had really one good plan for tech, and then lots of documents that said the same thing. So that and but was heard a lot more 10 years ago, and we're going to talk about that journey, and at the end I'll talk about how we got to that and then, and how we keep maturing the program. But it's all about how we keep making ourselves better, and through the journey we've been able to do that as we collaborate together. Ziba?
Thank you. And our core values are as our guiding light that frames how we do things and what we do successfully. And that really speaks to, do I have that slide?
Yeah, you've got to advance one more.
You got it.
Again, going back to our core values, the one before, there you go. To be open, keep things simple, put people first, having a hard time reading this, act responsibly, make things better. And I think, Joyce, you alluded to, we're all about people when it comes to our customers, to our employees, and this is, our people are our biggest asset. I remember my past organization that I worked with, one of our executives had said, actually it was an insurance company as well, and said, pretty much you guys are the company, because once you go home, the company is left with just assets, physical assets as buildings, logos, computers, and so on. So Liberty takes that very seriously, and they prove it every day to us as employees. So I'm very proud Liberty Mutual employee. Also, our trust in our people with their commitment to our policyholders, to throughout any kind of crisis, again, to keep things simple, to make sure that we are prepared to hold our commitment to our policyholders during the time of their needs, and also taking care of our employees in a case of an unforeseeable event. The next three bullets are kind of interconnected. Again, that speaks to having the commitment to our policyholder to make sure that we act responsibly, make things better during any kind of a disastrous event, that we help through our planning, help all involved during the recovery and exercises.
So I would say as well, from what Ziba shared, none of these things weren't important before, but there's definitely a mind shift for us. Insurance company, we like lots of data, we like to talk about things a lot. So it's really been a push for us to keep things simple, to really put our people first, as both Joyce and Ziba said, and really think about how events impact us as we go forward. And I'm going to start off, as I said, Joyce and I are on the same team, although we're on, right, all of us are on the larger Liberty team. We've been really working together very closely with the other members of our global business continuity team to think about risk and resilience even more so than we did in the past. And as we've heard, from speakers throughout the conference, we've talked a lot about being reactive in the future. We're really moving to a more proactive stance. And it's a lot of what guided us as we move forward with our project. And so pre-COVID, and Joyce will talk about it in just a couple minutes, and Michelle already gave you a preview of where we're at with a lot of plans. So we really want to take you on this journey. Pre-COVID, things were much more complicated for our programs, and not to say that our work isn't complex, because it continues to be, but we really used the learnings that we gained throughout the COVID response, and that really helped us to evaluate our program and think about how we could improve. And we also want to make sure that we're thinking about organizational resilience and have that approach. So we work directly with our leadership, and we're working with our business partners as well to get their feedback, input, buy-in as we build this resilience across the organization. And I can say that, I'm personally thrilled when I'm talking to a leader and they use the term continuity. They really understand business continuity or crisis management and organizational resilience from our experience of pandemic and events over the past few years in a way that's very different, I feel like, from when we used to engage them. So really from the board all the way through to the employees, we're thinking about that continuum to make sure we have that awareness and we have buy-in throughout the process. Additionally, you can see from this, we're really looking at our deeper dive piece here is really having worked successfully together through the pandemic throughout the organization. We feel like we've gotten better and really learned from our experience. And we kept asking ourselves, how do we really understand what we need as a company to be successful in our areas? And what was the best way to get there? So we kept questioning over and over again our programs as they were post-COVID, how they changed throughout the response, because rapidly we had to do that, and then where we want to be in the future. So we're always asking ourselves that. We spent time with focus groups. In our business continuity program, we have what we call plan owners and plan builders, our function owners, and then individuals who are responsible to do the work directly with us over time. And we looked at our program as a whole, we looked at how we were doing the plans, and all of the drawbacks, so to speak, of what our current process was, to think about how we can continue to add more value as we go forward our ROV. So some of the things that we looked at was, could we create dashboards? We were very plan heavy. When I first got to Liberty, and Joyce helped very early on in the program in her role, so no disrespect there, but we had 60 to 100 page Word documents that we asked the business to work with us on, and that was our output. And we stored them, right? You know, everyone I think talks about the binders, right, and the door stops. And they were, and it wasn't that there was not good information there, but in today's world, as many people have echoed throughout the conference, we really need to keep up with the business, and we know that our leadership and our business partners are working with dashboards. They're very visual. They want the information in that way, so that's really one of the ways that we've really looked at giving that information versus we still have plan documents, but really looking at how we can get that information to them as quickly as possible.
All right, now you guys got to put up with me standing up again. So as Ashley mentioned, lots and lots of plans. We had a lot of different types of plans. There were business continuity plans. We had our emergency management plans. We had our crisis plans. And one of the things we learned in talking to people is that we really needed everything to work together so closely, whether it's the DR plans, the pandemic plans, all of these things needed to come together. So in talking about them, we said, okay, how do we bring these together? And some of the solutions we talked about, as Ashley mentioned, were dashboards. We also knew that we needed consistent data points, because while we had data that we were looking at within the business continuity team, we were looking at maybe some different things and from the way Michelle might be looking at it, or from the way Ziba might be looking at it, and more importantly, from how our business looked at it. So we needed to connect in with them. We needed to make sure that we had consistent understanding, and in the way we just organized the look into the plans, the hierarchy had to be consistent across the organization. And we wanted to make sure that we were balancing the engagement at every level of the organization. We're going to chat a little bit more about that. But a big piece too, Ashley brought it up, is we had plans that were like 75 pages in length. And I remember one time exercising with an underwriting team, and the senior VP of the underwriting group said, "Do you mean to tell me we have a 75-page document to tell me to go work from home if the office is down?" I was like, yeah, but that was the way we had structured. Again, we, as an insurance companies love data. They love information. But the key is, how do we take that and make it quick so that they can act upon it? So if you want to go on to the next slide. So what is it that we're really looking to solve for when we said that we needed to integrate all of our, the way that we work together? We're going to talk about each section separately, But in the end, all of these pieces are really coming together. So I'll start with the business continuity piece of it. And in talking to people, it shouldn't have been as a big surprise. We had a lot of plans. We had a lot of people who had to go into these plans and exercise and update. And when COVID hit, people didn't pull out their plans. They didn't look at those. And yet, as an organization, we were still really successful in our response to COVID. So what we did is we wanted to understand what worked really well with that, and then evolve our business continuity process to take advantage of all those lessons learned during COVID.
Yep. Joyce and I just wanted to add that some of them did ask for their plans, right? But I think what we found is the nimbleness and the agility that we needed to respond to an event at a level we never had before as a company really forced us to use different methodology than we had in the plans as they existed today.
Great. So now we have our next poll question too. So when we started this business continuity journey, when I say we had a lot of plans, how many plans do you think we had?
They made technology have 200, so I'm going to tell you that's just a
You need more plans, Michelle?
No, we don't. No. But.
So this is a poll question. 973, if only. We had over 2,400 plans. How about that? Yep. And only 5 people in our business continuity department trying to manage all of these plans. So you can imagine where the bulk of this work fell. It fell on our operations. And if you want to.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah, we had a lot of plans. Actually, I think you need to back up one more.
Got it.
There we go. So we started this journey of really saying we need to think about things differently in the fall of 2020. And as you can imagine, we're working from home just like Doug and Limu are. And fall is the time that we normally do our business continuity exercise. It would have been that time when I said, Michelle, you gotta update those 200 or so plans for technology. You need to exercise them. And I'm gonna do a little compliance checklist to see where you are with that, and then report out to leadership on where we stand and how ready we are. And so with that, we said, you know what, let's rethink this. How can we step back from that compliance piece and step back from that and really do something that's going to be meaningful for the organization? So Ashley already shared all of the different kind of ways that we engage. We talk to our leadership, we could talk to stakeholders, we talk to plan builders, we talk to Michelle, we talk to, I don't know if we talked to Ziba, we might have talked to
IT.
We talked to IT. But we didn't just look inside our organization, we also reached out to folks out in the industry. Ashley pulls together folks to chat about business continuity on a monthly basis within the insurance industry. And we also talked to our vendor Fusion and talk to them about what works, what are they seeing that's helpful. And that really helped us step into the solutions we're going to share today.
And they were one of the groups that gave us the insight of really looking at the dashboard as a vehicle for decision making in crisis events. So just wanted to give them some credit for that.
Yep. So with the support of leadership, we dove down and we really examined the way that we approached things during the crisis. And one of the things that we saw was kind of missing, and I think it was discussed earlier today too, about the need to really engage the whole organization. And in fact, that's what we did during the pandemic. We reached and had engagement at every level of the organization. And yet, the way that we had structured our business continuity programming, the plans and the engagements many times took place just at that function level. And we'd work with this function and that function and this group and that group. And we really needed that way to begin to pull all of them together. Secondly, when we talk to people, obviously, as you heard, the plans, these big long plans, weren't necessarily doing what people wanted them to do. And they said, you know, when a crisis happens, when something happens, they want the ability to quickly go in and understand what's going on, understanding how it impacts them, and be able to determine, you know, assess what was happening so that they could quickly make decisions and take action up and down the organization. And they like to call these all-in-one plans. That was the term that came from the business. So our solutions to that in working with them was two things. We said, okay, we want to develop relationships at that mid-level of the organization. And again, an organization of 53,000 or 50,000 employees or so, thereabouts, there's a lot in that mid-level. So we really had been missing out on an opportunity by just engaging folks in the front line and engaging folks at the top. So that was the first step, is reaching out with those folks. The second thing was really to begin to examine how can we do our plans differently? How can we provide the information, the data that people need in order to take quick action and make decisions?
And I think another insight that we gained from that feedback from this business was what Joyce just talked about. They wanted an all-in-one plan, and the way our program has been structured, it still is today. But we have an emergency response plan for evacuation, shelter in place. What do you do to get out of a facility, really? We have crisis management plans, which are a bit more in depth in terms of threats and hazards, and then a continuity plan, which I've always really called more of a business recovery plan. But really, when you talk to the business, they go outside of even our traditional thoughts around disasters to BAU. So they're thinking about, oh, if we have fraud, if we have compliance issues for claims, what do we do? That's a continuity to the business. So it's really started to force us to think differently.
So our first step, we knew we wanted to take this journey. We knew we wanted to evolve, and our first step really was to begin to engage those business continuity champions. So again, folks out in the operations that we had worked with during COVID at that mid-level. And what we did is we set up business continuities by market, by like a major strategic business unit, by country in some cases, or by a key corporate department. And with that, we really looked at aligning it around 3 areas that we needed their support on and engagement on. One was what to do when a crisis happens. So again, we know, and Ashley's going to chat a little bit more about our crisis response organization and how we have set up those crisis teams. But we knew that we needed that engagement at that level because they're the ones that know and can connect the dots between all of those functions that are out there within a given business unit or within a given market and help them to work more holistically on solving an issue. We also looked, as I keep pointing to Michelle because she kept getting beat up on, hey, Michelle, we got to get these plans done. We got to get them updated. But we said, you know what? Our business operations needs to own that. We'll provide them the resources, the support, but we really want them to drive that within their own organization. And this really comes from that spot that, it needs to come from the leadership in each respective area on down, not just from the business continuity folks bugging them, saying you got to get this done. This has to come line management right down, saying this is important. Everybody owns this from a risk standpoint. Everybody needs to be part of the solution. So whether it's BIA, whether it's updating the plan, whether it's the exercise, we're there to help guide them through it, but we need their hand-in-hand partnership up and down the organization. And then finally, the last piece, really critical for the business continuity champions, is that they help us get better. We operate under continuous improvement, and we want them to give us that feedback, help us to understand what their organization is doing, how they're changing, and to provide that feedback to us so that we can help adjust our plans, adjust our programs to best meet their needs and provide the greatest value.
I have one comment to add. So, you know, when I started, they had 249 plans. That's why they needed to have a person come in to do click, click, click. But in 2 years, we got to agreement, because I don't mind being the guinea pig for change. So we were able to really use some of the ideas that we had in tech about simplifying plans. And we got down to 44. Wasn't ideal, but it was better, right? And it was easier to manage and coordinate across the different technical groups. So although it was a long journey, and you know, now we're down to the one plan that I've been asking for since I got there. Woo, 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 woo.
2 plans.
Well, international, yeah, we have to still, for privacy reasons, have
almost there.
You know, certain plans separate. But other than that, you know, we are continuing to move forward as a group. And you know, my role is more to be that champion with Joyce and Ashley and their team from a technology standpoint, to make it easier for me as well as them, and then our business groups, to make it so everybody understands how things are going.
Great. So working with our business continuity champions then helped to provide that input really to that next stage, which was evolving the plans themselves. And evolving the plans involved asking them a lot of key questions, but also really beginning to look at what is it that they want, what's that information that they need in order to be able to respond quickly to an event. And then also looking at what are all the sources of data, because we knew we had our business continuity data, but there's so much other data as an organization that we had that becomes relevant during a crisis. So talking to the business, finding that, and then another big piece of that is our vendor Fusion showed us some of the dashboards that they had created, and that helped trigger some additional thinking, and we showed some ideas to the business, and they kept saying, yes, this is what we want. It's not that paper plan that they keep tucked away in their car. It's this real-time access to information. I think we also talked about situational awareness, and I think our company's really good at situational awareness and understanding what's going on, but now the key is getting that, channeling that into the business so that they can say, oh, this is in this particular region, and help them to be able to quickly assess what's the impact, what does that mean for them? And also then, what's their strategies, what's the work that they need to do in that particular type of an event.
And our business really loves that approach.
They do. And you know, as we started talking about this whole dashboard approach, the business got excited because they said, you know, this is also going to help us to understand risk in other ways so that we can be more resilient, so that we can understand gaps, we can understand issues before we actually have an event. So we said, we need to have dashboards that help us to understand risk, to help us be more resilient. As well as dashboards that are going to help us in an actual crisis so that we can make quick decisions and take action. And the good thing, we had a lot of data. We've been going through, doing a BIA, updating all of that. So we knew that that data becomes very pivotal in understanding where the gaps might be for an organization, especially when you combine that data with data from our other departments like IT, like procurement, like our talent systems that we have out there, really begins to tell us this full picture of our organization and where risk is. Based on that, and I have to say we're still on that journey, this takes time. We have built out our first iteration of dashboards. We're beginning to work on our second. We're doing it in a platform that is comfortable and used across our entire organization so everybody can access that and help inform them. And if you
Power BI, which I'm sure many of you have access to as well.
So lots of technical stuff. I'm not a tech person, but all this stuff with data lakes and, you know, Snowflake and so lots of fun stuff. So, so the dashboards really provide us with a new way to quickly understand risk and understand where gaps might be. Again, this helps build overall organizational resilience, because leadership, business groups can take a look at this information and use that in regular business decision making day to day to help strengthen their organization, whether it's around staffing, whether it's around how much money do we give the DR folks, you know, how important is this, or whether it has to do with our vendors that we're working with, really fully understanding that. Now they can begin to link those pieces between IT, their operations, and continuity and resilience. Additionally, if you want to go on to the next slide, it also helps us to understand during a crisis. We have teams now that are beginning to exercise with these dashboards to say, oh, if we have this particular event, we have a power grid failure in the Northeast or in Texas, or something happened in the Pacific Northwest, what does it mean to our operations? And they can go in there and exercise, pull up the dashboards and see, here's the impact that it would be. Here's the strategies. Here's all of the groups across the entire market. So the beauty with this is that they can filter based on area, they can based on the level of the organization. So the dashboards really are helping them answer some of those questions and how to work holistically as a team. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley.
I'll just add too, they can look at where their staffing is concentrated as well as part of what we're building. They can also look at the level of criticality, right, of where something is happening in terms of the functions that are operating there. So those have all been really a force multiplier for us in the development of the dashboard. And Joyce said, we're continuing to iterate and build those. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through my section fairly quickly because I want to give my colleagues time to present as well and give a little time for questions at the end. But I think I'll say up front and speak for my colleagues that if you have any questions afterwards, please reach out to us as well. So another key element of this, and as Regina spoke about earlier, that crisis management piece has been a key driver for our work in revamping our program. And another aspect that we were looking at, as Joyce was speaking about our plan types earlier, and we've mentioned, is also thinking about our crisis management plans. So we had two things. We understood that we needed from COVID and from other events that we really needed to refresh our structure. So we looked at our gaps, or our opportunities, as we like to call them in Liberty, for improvement. And one of those areas was looking at, we had a lot of plans in this space as well as our business continuity plans. And so right now in the US, we are piloting going from about 64 plans to one plan for the entire country. And that is really, and I'll talk about in a minute, a bit more aligned with how we do things outside of the United States as well. Another piece of this was really to look at, as I said, that overall structure. From our learnings from COVID and other events over the last few years, we realized that particularly at our market level, there wasn't, and there had been in the past, but our organization of a crisis team at those levels really had eroded quite a bit. So they struggled in the beginning of the pandemic to really organize themselves. So that's been really a big part of our goal, is to make sure that we have that organizational level, and all of you saw the visual that Regina shared earlier. That's really how we've mapped out our organization. Another key piece is we've always had great support from our leadership, but we really didn't have a formal executive crisis team, and so we're putting that in place. We've revamped our corporate or enterprise crisis management team as well. Although we're trying to keep things very nimble and make sure we have the right core group of people in place, we are understanding that for different types of events, we may have to bring in subject matter experts, expand that, adjust that depending on who the players are. But particularly at our market level, as I said, one of the things that they recognized is they needed to have streamlined and clear directions for communication to their leadership within the markets, as well as along the lines of business, and then making sure that they have connections to that enterprise crisis management team. And amazingly, we realized in looking at this, we invited them as needed, but they didn't formally sit on our enterprise crisis team. It really was that traditional legal, HR, real estate ourselves, right? So we are we are purposefully expanding that as we go forward. And then we're re-looking, as Joyce said, we're still on our journey, and we're re-looking at our local programs, because traditionally our program was very much focused on location. We were very location-based, as were our plans, which is one of the reasons Michelle had so many plans in IT, because we didn't have great situational awareness of where our functions were performed, and that's one of the reasons we went in that direction. Obviously, technology, advances in the program, et cetera, are enabling us to really change that. So outside of the US, just to give you a bit of an idea of how Liberty operates, outside of the United States, traditionally the countries have had their own plans, but as Joyce was saying, that's shifting as well into more market-based, because they realized from COVID that they might have both of the major markets operating within a single country, but they weren't talking to each other. So they're looking at opportunities as well. Outside of the US, the crisis teams are the executive leadership. The way that Liberty has grown, and it's not a secret, is to buy other insurance companies, right? So often that leadership would become that crisis team and then working with their teams internally. Inside of the US, it's a bit more complicated because we have multiple areas of the country where the markets operate. So we are really more of, I'm kind of calling it the FEMA of our organization, because we really help to coordinate the events across, excluding IT, so I want to acknowledge that. We do have we're more porous than we used to be in working and collaborating together, and that's one of the points that I wanted to make coming up. As we started working a few years ago to have more of a unified command and how we work together, because cyber has its own response, IT, DR has its own response. We're really responsible more for the operational side, traditionally working with locations for fire, natural disasters, et cetera. But really we've realized as we've moved forward that we have much more of an opportunity to work together from COVID and even from the hurricanes over the last few years. And in fact, last year we responded and participated in 122 events across the enterprise, and that is the highest number since we've started keeping those metrics. But I want to give a caveat that the way that we might define crisis in this room may not define how we organize or how we capture that information in our system today, because we really think about what is a risk much more than we do. So if we have an item or we have an event that could become a risk, could become an impact, an incident, or a crisis, we're also logging that if we're communicating that and doing some preparedness work across the organization. Michelle's been a great partner in working across these collaborative groups to really bring us together, and what you see on the screen is some of the areas that we defined as opportunities to better collaborate, communicate, and work together. Michelle, any quick thoughts on that process before we move on?
No, I think, the collaboration is key. We have a Monday, Thursday huddle for Intel, where we sit around with our security people, we sit around with our market teams, and we talk about what is the intelligence out there. We have the tools, but what are the ones that are bubbling up? What are the ones that we really want to focus on? And how do we want to make sure that we're all aware, and who's going to take lead should one of those things turn into that crisis versus just an event that we're monitoring, right? So the Intel huddles have been good. Then we have the working team that she's talking about. And for me, the working team has allowed me to, develop some other members of the team. So, I'm not the only one that they can call anymore. It's other members of the tech resiliency so that they understand how we're having, growth. And it's always going to be change in the teams, but it's making sure that you also have a backup, because it can't just be me. It's got to be the organization of tech and understanding how we're going to work together in large-scale events in every crisis.
And in this collaborative group, we've really brought together our CAT teams, right, that respond to our natural disasters and really work with our claimants. When things happen, we've brought together our communications teams for issues management, thinking about reputational concerns. We work closely. We have ERM. They're not a responder group, but they help us to understand the risks to the organization. So just to give you an idea of other participants in that group as well. So as we've talked about, the theme of thinking about our employees is definitely our guiding star. And what you see here are things that we think about on an ongoing basis for our work. So we really look at our values, as others said. when do we activate, why do we activate, making sure that we have all of these groups together. And I'm going to go forward just in the interest of time. So our refresh structure, as I said, really make sure that we are engaging with our executives at the right levels. So we think about it in terms of we're always communicating with them, whether it's we just use a low, medium, high structure. We have the right levels of communication, but we're thinking about when do we activate them formally at the highest level for a catastrophic event like a COVID or another type of event. But we want to make sure we have those market representatives, as I shared earlier. We have all of representatives from our working team engaged when we need to. And then not least at all, making sure that we're thinking about locally how those teams continue to respond. And I'll just give a quick example of the severe weather event many of you have likely had heard about a few years ago in Texas with the power grid going down. We have a major campus there in Plano, Texas. And we very quickly spun up our corporate or enterprise response team to assist. We then worked very closely with the locals, so we were having huddles with our local response team, with our corporate team to collaborate together to make sure that we're coordinated and aligned and made sure it was the most effective response possible while we were responding to direct inputs from that team. And it was challenging for us because some of the response activities that we might have utilized, for example, many more people still working from home at that time as they continued to, we couldn't just bring them back into the office because of the nature of that event. The infrastructure wasn't built for severe cold weather. So we had pipes bursting going on, so we couldn't safely bring employees back in, our insurance adjusters, to do their job. So we ended up working with a vendor that worked closely with the market, and they were able to bring them into their office another town over. So those are some of the lessons learned and the things that we've expanded as I think Dave was talking about event neutral. We're trying to think about what could be the cascading events and effects from events in a different way, I would say, than we used to. And then here, just to close out, we've really looked to how can we realign across the organization, reimagine the work when we think about crisis and recovery, really refresh our program and make sure that it's continual. So that's why we're using the phrase journey throughout our conversation today, because it really is for us reshaping, right, our response as we need to and reigniting, we hope, excitement of engaging in this work so people are prepared ahead of events happening. So now I want to turn it over to Michelle to talk about I'm not going to call it DR anymore, this LM Tech Resilience, about their journey.
So, dependencies, everybody today is dependent on technology in some format in our organization. There's no getting around it. Some of the workarounds that were there are not even functional based on the size and magnitude of the workload. So, one of the discussions that we always have is they have to wait till we recover or restore. And it's really hard. So, we're talking a lot about how we close the gap from a functional standpoint, but it is those dependencies that our business is always looking at. So we'll go on to the next slide because we're going to talk about, how many team members are dedicated to LM Tech Resiliency DR? Use, 3, 9, 16, or everyone.
I see the answers coming in.
Is it split?
We'll give it another minute.
We'll give it a moment. But
nobody says we have the highest number of people, right?
No.
Oh, wait.
Wait, they switched.
It just popped out.
So actually, the word dedicated is probably, if you look at that, there's probably a smaller number. But when we look at resiliency at Liberty, we really are talking about everyone from tech. Everyone's going to play a role. It builds off of the incident management process. We have a small team and we have market leads, so like Ziba, but in an event, we expect everyone to step up. This might come from a utility background where everybody had to go out in the storm kind of thing, but it has helped guide some of the process changes that we're going to talk about and the things that we're doing in tech. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So,
That's me.
Ziba.
Thank you. So once there was a wise man that had stated that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's what we really are trying to do. And with that said, a few things that my colleagues have mentioned about we pretty much going from the terminology from a DR to a resiliency. That is our goal. But we're still doing, I mean, that is our goal by migrating to the cloud, and I will get into that a little bit later to give you some information. However, we're still doing DR as well. So we're in a hybrid situation. So with that said, I'm sorry, do I have the right information here? So my apologies.
We just went
The
forward.
notes are
If
not
that helps,
matching.
Ziba.
She just moved forward to past for you.
You want me to go back? Up to you.
Probably. Oh, there you go. The next one. That says Ziba on it. But regardless, what we're trying to solve here, as I mentioned to you earlier when I introduced myself, that we have a global footprint, and we have close to about 2,000 mission-critical business applications that I have the reverse problem to my colleagues. My hope was that we would have more DR plans, because for every single business application, we would have an associated DR plan. And so we have a very small scope that we have been improving year after year since I've been here. So with that said, part of when we're talking about prevention versus cure is that we're trying to actually partner, and again, you heard the theme about collaboration with application development teams and architects to really to develop and create structures and business application systems that we can withstand and or prevent a loss of services or data. And I'm sure throughout this past few days that if you've attended the ransomware sessions, we're trying to protect data from bad actors or loss of services. So, and part of, again, my apologies, the prints are very small on the slides. And again, from what we try to solve is to reduce our technical debt, and one way of doing that, we actually migrate into the cloud, so to reduce the costs associated with hardware that we internally manage. And another thing is that to really be agile. About 5 years ago, we adopted the agile methodology, pretty much replacing the iterative and a traditional waterfall methodology for delivering products. Initially, we rolled it out in IT organizations and later into our business partners, and that really allows the smaller teams to focus on rapid delivery of products and allow them to deliver, assess, adjust, and repeat. So with that said, did you want to add anything,
No, that's
Jill?
fine.
It's you again.
Go ahead.
Yep, okay. So allow me to walk you through our memory lane when it comes to our DR journey from past to present to future. In the past, as I mentioned, with 2,000 mission critical applications, we have very low participation in developing DR. It wasn't really a priority for a lot of application teams. They're focusing on developing production and supporting. So it has been a struggle. However, what has, we had like, as Michelle alluded earlier, would love paper documentation and the DR exercises that would do very manually intensive labor that would take from pre-planning to actually holding the DR exercises, which actually what it does, the failover from primary data centers to alternate data centers. We actually isolate the DR environment, and which is pretty much involves all hands on deck, from application teams, market coordinators, Michelle's team from Resiliency, from enterprise level, firewall, the engineers for networking solutions, pretty much have a command center starting at 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. And prior to that, it was literally 24 hours for a period of 2 to 3 weeks. And that's what we're trying to get away from. And one of our logo is to continuous improvement. And again, thinking about the agile methodology that we assess our situation on a daily basis to see what we can do to improve our processes. So with that said, one of the RTO, I just want to talk about the RTO, is that, again, going back to the number of mission critical applications that we have and the low participation in the DR validation, and lower than that, having a valid, viable DR plan in place. In a case of a disastrous event, a large-scale event, a lot of application will not be able to recover, or they have not been able to validate if they could.
Great. Yeah, I think the only other thing I'd add on our past, when I got here, we used to make people do a lot of what we called the infrastructure recovery requirements document, and that was a separate document from the plan. So I love data, so I took tools and I pulled all that data together so no one had to give me that information. And we put it in a dashboard, and now we use that to help them plan and use it to develop their plans so that you don't have to do these things. There's technology out there that will make things easier, but it does take time to make sure you pull it all together correctly. And the other thing in the past is, I heard this in one of the sessions, and I'm sorry I'm re-quoting, but we used to plan and test so that we didn't fail. My colleague says, and 2 years ago with some reorganizations and so forth, and the team changed, he's like, we need to change our mantra. And I agree that we test to learn. And that is the whole reason that we want to be focused on testing. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about is we look at the present and the future. So back to you, Ziba.
That's a great point.
We're at our next one.
Oh, our next question. How many people were enabled to work from home when we closed the offices? This kind of talks to our journey, while you guys are filling that out. Ultimately, when we, pre-COVID, we had a tool that we had built between GBC and tech called the Site Impact Tool. It was meant for those bad weather events to find out who couldn't work from home. So when we scaled it during COVID, we could see that 80% of our staff had that capability day one. They had at least worked from home once in the last week, once in the last 2 weeks. It was that 20% that we had to work on and make sure that when we did close the offices, that they could actually work from home. And because of that information that we had and data, we were able to have 100% of our staff work from home, except for our essential. We all had those, right? We had the few people who still needed to be in the office to get the mail, to secure our offices. So it's balancing the information you have and the capabilities and knowing when to maybe scale it differently or take the data and look at it differently. So move on to the next slide. And here we are in the present. Back.
Great, thank you. So as I mentioned, that was our past, and presently, we're in a hybrid situation when it comes to DR. We still have a lot of legacy applications hosted on-prem, and we go through DR exercises once a year, and we actually have one coming up in a few weeks. But the good news is that we have our executive sponsorship. When I attended the fall, the Phoenix conference, one of the speakers says, in order to have a successful program, you need to have a seat at the C level. And we do now, which is amazing. that, again, my experience of being with this program for the past 7 years, for the first time we have executive sponsorship, and it's part of everybody's objective to actually develop, maintain a resilient business applications from an IT perspective. And at this point, we have started migration to the cloud about 3-4 years ago. We have more than 50% of our applications have been migrated to the cloud. And within the next 2 years, our objective is to be fully migrated to the cloud, which is pretty much addresses the DR versus resiliency. And we're focusing on developing resilient applications as opposed to recovery. So with that said, did you want
Yeah, so
to move?
just before we go into the future, just on the present, the cloud is not the panacea of, you have to still design it. And I'm sure all of the tech people out here, oh, I moved to the cloud, I'm resilient. No, only if you designed it that way. Same principles of on-prem, but you just have a lot more capabilities. And that's one of the things that Ziba and I have to regularly remind our application teams, make sure you consider it. And to her point, in the present, we do have that executive leadership. We have the sponsorship we've been looking for. And I think the other thing that we've been doing in the present is we are a small team from a resiliency standpoint and market area, but we have an incident management team that works 24/7 and get involved in a lot of things. We've, in the present, started training them to be ready to be part of the resilience effort and the recovery. Because most of our technical events are gonna come through the help desk, a ticket, someone screaming at a leadership level, something like that. And it's gonna start as an incident. And then we'll decide, does it need to be fully resilient? Do we need to implement those further practices that have been put and developed? So that's really where we are in a lot in the present, is working with across the ITSM portfolio and all of the services that we have, incident, problem, change, making sure that if there is an item in an incident that should be addressed, looking at automation at the present, how do we stop doing some of these things, monitoring appropriately. So it's making sure that we're consistent on all of our apps, which kind of brings us to the present, or to the future, sorry. So ultimately, the availability. SLAs, they're not the same as the RTO and RPO, but they should have a relationship. We have people who say they are 24/7 applications, and then they say they're a low criticality to the organization. So there might be some differences. So we're using the data to go back and rediscuss these things through application impact assessment. We've been doing this in GRS with Ziba for the last few years. We've rolled it out globally. Every app needs to reevaluate their RTO and RPO annually, and understanding how it fits into the business functions. We're looking at the CMDB differently. How do we use that data versus what I've historically had to do, bring lots of different sources together? How do we use that to drive the future of understanding resilience and capabilities? And looking at it from an enterprise standpoint. And then, we've all heard operational resiliency. What does that mean? How do we stop it? Is the monitoring in place? Are we seeing tick marks in the monitoring that we need to take action before it falls off the rails? So a lot of that that we've heard all the last few days is where we're going in our future. And it's just making sure that we stay current. We keep our leadership up to date on what we're doing. And we do regular CIO notices across the markets. We do IT owner notices. So it's making sure they're all understanding. And as Ziba stated, we have in tech a goal and growth that everybody has done an AIA and has a DR plan and has tested it. And that's really where the focus is. Tested it. A plan is only as good as the paper it was written on, or the document that it's in, and dashboard. But so we're more focused on testing and making sure that we understand what the opportunities are to make it better, and address the RTO and RPO. And that's really where we've been focusing. Anything
And
else you want to add?
I know we're running out of time, so
Okay.
any final thoughts from
Yeah, I
Michelle
just
and
want to
Ziba?
add to, again, part of the journey has been the things that we have accomplished over the last 2 years. Michelle mentioned the AIAs that to develop to identify mission critical application and make sure that we do have viable plans in place. And if not, in order to reinforce that, we do have the audit findings that if the mission critical applications do not have a viable or validated plans, that they would get a risk registered in tools that gets escalated to the top. And the other piece that we actually have accomplished was that for the vendor-hosted applications or the SaaS products, that we never really require them to provide us the DR plan. So this last year, we actually worked with our procurement to include the language in our contracts, the new ones and on a new renewal, to request as a requirement that they need to provide us on an annual basis to provide us the valid DR plans as well as the test results on an annual basis to make sure that we can certify those applications and be resilient.
So I think we want to leave you with is that we are definitely a collaborative group, as you can see, even though we are in various parts of the business. We have made an effort consciously over the last few years to come together more and more. You can even see that in the dashboards. We're all looking to use that in terms of sharing data with the business to be more effective and efficient in working with them around our disciplines. So any final thoughts from the team? Otherwise, just wanted to share with you some of our next steps. And I know we didn't get time for Q&A, so if you sent in questions, DRJ, if there's a way for us to post those answers, we'd be happy to work to do that. So I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hand it back over to Vanessa to close us out, and thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you do have a few minutes for questions. There's about 4 minutes, so if there are questions.
We can stay.
Anyone
No
who has a
questions.
question
Okay,
wins
sorry.
a bottle.
Sorry. No questions. I'll let you guys walk off stage and we'll do a few ending announcements. Thank you guys. Absolutely. So one thing I loved about the presentation here today, which echoed from yesterday's presentation with OnSolve and Delta, is just the energy, the partnership, and the collaboration between the different teams and the business units. So I'm very excited to continuously see that. Please don't forget to use the survey in the app to provide your notes and your comments about today's session. As we close, I have a few themes just wanted to share that I heard from you all throughout the conference, from the virtual as well as the in-person attendees. Theme number one is that change is inevitable. We heard this from our first keynote speaker on Monday, and it's really how we respond to it that is the one thing that we can actually control. Theme number two, bold leadership and deliberate action is necessary. And we saw that in some of the conversations that we had here, as well as with some of the initiatives that DRJ has rolled out. Theme number three, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is relevant to your business. It's relevant to business continuity. It's relevant to disaster recovery. It's relevant to cybersecurity. And so we are looking forward to how we will continuously evolve as a community within this space. Resilient coaches, I've heard that term used throughout this entire conference. One of the things that I draw a parallel to is, as a coach, we don't play on the field, we coach. And we have to help to put the players in the game, provide them the tools that they need to be successful. And so as we coach, we have to remember that our partners and our clients in the business, they are the players. And so that's really something that resonated with me today. And then lastly, one of the big outcomes that I've just experienced at DRJ is that it's the continuous partnership, the collaboration, and the friendship that we get to build. I had a chance to reconnect with Robert and Lisa and a few others, met some new friends with Kareen, Erica Briggs online, and it's just been really good to continuously build and continue to foster new friendships and new relationships. So there are boxed lunches for you available in the ballroom to our left, my left, your right, where the exhibit hall was. Closing announcements, the DRJ team would like to thank you, the in-person attendees, as well as the virtual attendees, the board members, the sponsors, and everyone that really contributed to make this 68th conference what it is. As a reminder, the mobile app will close after today's session and at the conclusion of our conference. However, the session replays and the recordings will still be available to you in the attendee hub, so you will receive an email today with a link to access that. And lastly, the call for papers is open or coming open live. So please feel free to check the website. They have things listed here. If you saw content that you want to bring forward, if you want to be a speaker, DRJ is actively looking for your participation. And we have to be the change that we want to see, right? So if we want to see something different, we have to do something different. So I would encourage you to please apply. If you don't get in, ask them why, right? That's how we evolve, that's how we learn, that's how we grow. So thank you so much, and we'll see you guys in Phoenix, Arizona in the fall.